It was the pride of the German fleet, a floating fortress of steel that seemed invincible, a battleship whose very name struck fear across the Atlantic, the Bismarck. Launched in 1939, it was more than just a warship. It was a symbol of Nazi naval power, a challenge hurled at the Royal Navy, daring Britain to defend its sea lanes. In May 1941, the Bismarck slipped into the North Atlantic with a single mission to smash Allied convoys and strangle Britain's lifeline. What followed was not just a naval battle, but one of the greatest sea chases in history, a hunt that would span thousands of miles, involve dozens of ships, and end with one of the most dramatic sinkings of the Second World War. The world watched in awe and terror, as the Bismarck proved its power almost immediately. In the icy waters of the Denmark Strait, it clashed with the Royal Navy's mightiest vessels and dealt Britain a shocking blow, the destruction of HMS Hood, the mighty Hood, pride of the fleet, sent to the bottom with nearly all hands in a single shattering explosion. For the British Admiralty, it was a national catastrophe, but it was also a call to arms. Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave the order that would echo across history: sink the Bismarck. From that moment on, the chase became relentless. Every available ship, every reconnaissance aircraft, every ounce of Britain's naval strength was thrown into the pursuit. But the Bismarck was not easily cornered. With its speed, its heavy armor, and its deadly guns, it seemed capable of outrunning and outfighting anything in its path. As it made a desperate run for safety, dodging British warships and air attacks, the outcome hung in the balance. Could the Royal Navy catch it before it reached the shelter of occupied France? Would Britain's sea lanes remain under threat from a battleship that could tear through convoys with impunity? The fate of Britain's war effort and the morale of its people seemed to rest on this single chase. In the end, it would take torpedo bombers flying obsolete biplanes, battleships firing in pounding broadsides, and destroyers closing in through the night to bring the mighty giant down. The Bismarck's last hours were a thunderous inferno of fire, smoke, and twisted steel, a final stand that etched its name forever into the history of naval warfare. Tonight, we will trace the entire story of this legendary chase, from the ship's construction to its deadly mission, from the tragedy of HMS Hood to the desperate pursuit, and finally to the climactic battle that sent the Bismarck to the depths of the Atlantic. This is the story of pride, power, vengeance, and the lengths nations will go to when survival is at stake. So join us as we unravel one of the most dramatic naval episodes of the Second World War, the hunt and sinking of the Bismarck. And before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? The story of the Bismarck begins not on the seas, but in the aftermath of defeat. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh restrictions on Germany, forbidding battleships larger than 10,000 tons and crippling its naval ambitions. Yet the dream of maritime power never truly faded, for in Berlin and in shipyards along the North Sea coast, whispers of future giants persisted. The Reichsmarine, small and shackled, studied foreign navies and quietly preserved the skills needed for a day of renewal. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, he embraced the Navy as a symbol of prestige, even if his true obsession was with land and air. By 1935, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement loosened restrictions, granting Germany a ratio of tonnage compared to Britain. This opened the door to battleship construction that far exceeded Versailles limits. Planners envisioned vessels that could match or surpass the great ships of the Royal Navy. Out of this ambition came the first sketches of what would become the Bismarck. The designers of the Bismarck faced a daunting challenge: to create a ship powerful enough to strike fear into Britain, yet modern enough to withstand the changing nature of naval warfare. Work began in the mid-1930s at Blohm and Voss, the famed Hamburg shipyard. The blueprints called for a displacement of over 41,000 tons, though official figures would be understated to deceive rivals. At 251 meters in length, and with a beam of 36 meters, she would dwarf anything in the existing German fleet. Her armor scheme was immense, with a belt up to 320 millimeters thick, designed to shrug off shells from 15-inch guns. The main battery comprised 8 38-centimeter, 15-inch guns in 4 turrets, capable of hurling shells over 35 kilometers. Secondary armaments included 5.9-inch guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and torpedo tubes. Speed was vital, so she was fitted with powerful engines producing over 150,000 horsepower. Every element was meant to create not just a battleship, but a floating fortress. Hitler himself took an active interest in the Bismarck, though often with little understanding of naval realities. He viewed the ship as a political weapon as much as a military one, a symbol to impress both the German people and foreign powers. The Kriegsmarine, under Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, hoped the ship would become the spearhead of a growing surface fleet. Raeder's vision was the ambitious Plan Z, a rearmament program envisioning dozens of capital ships to challenge Britain by the mid-1940s. In practice, the plan was impossible to realize once war began in 1939. Yet the Bismarck embodied its spirit, bold, expensive, and aimed at breaking Britain's sea power. Hitler insisted that the ship carry his personal stamp of grandeur, with interior spaces fit for propaganda tours. Engineers, meanwhile, focused on balance, blending firepower, speed, and protection. This dual purpose, practical war machine and political showpiece, defined the Bismarck from the beginning. Construction began in July 1936 at Blohm and Voss's Great Slipway in Hamburg, where workers labored under strict secrecy. By February 1939, the hull was ready for launch, and a grand ceremony was staged to mark the occasion. Hitler himself attended, underscoring the importance placed upon this new battleship. The ship was named for Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor who had unified Germany in the 19th century, linking past glory with future ambition. Thousands of onlookers watched as the massive hull slid into the water, its black and grey steel looming like a monument to power. Inside, work continued for nearly 2 more years, fitting the engines, armament, and vast array of compartments. Over 2,200 compartments and watertight bulkheads made her one of the most complex machines ever built in Germany. Skilled craftsmen assembled the giant turrets, each weighing over 1,000 tons. By late 1940, the Bismarck was nearly ready for sea trials. A legend was taking shape in steel. Technically, the Bismarck represented the pinnacle of German battleship design. Her armor scheme followed the all-or-nothing principle, concentrating maximum protection around magazines, engines, and vital systems. Her deck armor reached 100 millimeters, giving resilience against plunging fire at long range. The 38-centimeter SKC-34 guns were among the finest naval artillery in the world, with remarkable accuracy and destructive power. Advanced fire control systems allowed coordinated salvos, guided by optical rangefinders and radar. Her engines, geared turbines fed by 12 Wagner boilers, drove 3 massive propellers, pushing the ship to speeds over 30 knots. She carried sophisticated damage control systems, including pumps and redundant compartments, to ensure survival in battle. Crew accommodations were relatively comfortable, reflecting Germany's emphasis on morale. In every way, she was engineered for both combat endurance and psychological intimidation. To those who saw her in Hamburg, she was the embodiment of modern naval power. The Bismarck was more than just steel and machinery. She was the product of ideology and ambition. For Hitler, she was proof that Germany had broken free of Versailles and rejoined the ranks of great naval powers. For Raeder, she was the foundation of a strategy to strangle Britain through commerce raiding and surface engagements. For the German people, she was a source of national pride, celebrated in propaganda films and newspaper headlines. Workers who had endured economic hardship saw her as a triumph of German industry. Young sailors dreamed of serving aboard her, imagining themselves as part of a new era of naval dominance. Each rivet hammered into her hull seemed to echo with the promise of revanche. Yet beneath the pride lay overconfidence. Few foresaw the dangers of committing such giants in a war increasingly dominated by air power. The seeds of tragedy were sown even in triumph. By late 1940, the Bismarck was ready for sea trials, and she did not disappoint. In the Baltic, she steamed at high speed, her massive engines performing flawlessly. Gunnery tests showed her main battery could hurl shells with devastating accuracy, smashing targets at extreme range. Her maneuverability impressed observers, unusual for such a massive vessel. Reports from trial officers praised her seaworthiness, stability, and crew performance. Even foreign intelligence took notice, with British agents scrambling to gather details on this new threat. The Royal Navy recognized that a ship of such size and firepower posed a direct challenge to its supremacy. In Berlin, propaganda trumpeted the trials as proof of German superiority. Yet beneath the headlines, the Kriegsmarine knew one ship could not alter the balance of global naval power. Still, the Bismarck was ready to take her place in history. The completion of the Bismarck marked a turning point for Germany's navy, but also the beginning of a fatal gamble. She was a masterpiece of design, but also a colossal investment, consuming resources in a war that increasingly favored submarines and aircraft. As she prepared for her first operational mission, expectations were immense. Hitler saw her as untouchable, Raeder as indispensable, and the German people as invincible. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, watched with growing alarm, determined that she could never be allowed to roam free. The stage was set for a confrontation that would electrify the world. The Bismarck had been born from ambition, pride, and defiance of Versailles. She was a giant forged in steel, carrying both promise and doom. Her story had just begun, and the oceans awaited her. On February 14th, 1939, the city of Hamburg held its breath as the colossal hull of the Bismarck prepared to meet the waters of the River Elbe. The Blum and Voss shipyard had worked tirelessly for 3 years, and now the largest battleship ever built in Europe stood poised on the slipway. A crowd of thousands gathered, filling every vantage point along the harbour, their eyes fixed on the steel leviathan before them. Nazi banners fluttered in the cold wind, their scarlet fields and black swastikas framing the stage for political theatre. Hitler himself arrived, surrounded by senior officials and military leaders, knowing this event would echo across the Reich. The Bismarck was not just a ship, it was propaganda forged in steel, a visible declaration that Germany was once again a maritime power. As trumpets blared, the ceremony began, mixing tradition with the regime's ideological pomp. The shipyard echoed with speeches celebrating strength, destiny, and national pride. Every moment was choreographed to project the return of German greatness. At the center of the ceremony stood Dorothee von Lohenfeld, the granddaughter of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, after whom the battleship was named. She christened the ship with champagne, invoking the spirit of her ancestor who had unified Germany decades earlier. This symbolic gesture tied the modern battleship to the nation's storied past, blending history with present ambition. Hitler applauded vigorously, understanding the propaganda value of such connections. For the German public, the Bismarck was not just steel and rivets, but a resurrection of empire, dignity, and strength. Photographers captured every angle, ensuring images of the launch would be printed in newspapers across Europe. Newsreels later broadcast the moment in cinemas, where audiences gasped at the ship's sheer scale. The Bismarck's name carried weight, evoking power and unity at a time when Hitler promised both. Through symbolism and spectacle, the regime made the ship more than a war machine. It became a floating monument to the Third Reich's ambitions. The technical spectacle of the launch was as breathtaking as the political theatre. When the supports were released, the 42,000-ton hull began its slow, majestic slide down the slipway. The shipyard trembled as the giant moved, its vast steel mass groaning under its own weight. Workers who had labored day and night for years erupted in cheers, watching their creation touch the water for the first time. A roar rose from the crowd as the Bismarck struck the Elbe with a thunderous splash, sending waves surging against the docks. The hull floated free, immense and imposing, dominating the harbour skyline. Observers remarked that it seemed less like a ship and more like a continent set adrift. Engineers immediately secured her, preparing for the long months of fitting out to come. Yet for that single moment, all eyes were on the spectacle of sheer power. Germany had launched its greatest battleship. Nazi propaganda seized upon the launch with calculated precision. Newspapers declared the event proof of Germany's technological genius and industrial strength. The Welkische Beobachter, the regime's official paper, proclaimed that the seas would tremble before the new battleship. Radio broadcasts extolled the feat as a triumph of German engineering over foreign restrictions. The timing was crucial, coming just months before the outbreak of war in Europe. Hitler wanted to send a message to Britain and France. Germany was not only resurgent on land, but also rising again at sea. Photographs of the Bismarck's launch were printed alongside headlines predicting a new era of naval dominance. The ship's sheer scale became a symbol of inevitability, a looming presence that suggested Germany could no longer be contained. For ordinary Germans, weary of Versailles' humiliation, the images were intoxicating. The Bismarck became a national icon before her guns were ever fired. The psychological impact of the launch reverberated far beyond Hamburg. In London, naval attachés reported anxiously on the ship's size and potential. The British Admiralty knew their supremacy was being challenged, and the Bismarck became an object of obsession in Whitehall. Intelligence officers scrambled to calculate her tonnage, her armament, and her threat to Atlantic trade. In Paris, similar concerns were raised, with France still uncertain of how to counter such a leviathan. Across the Atlantic, American observers also took note, though the United States remained officially neutral. The launch of the Bismarck sent ripples through every major naval power, altering calculations and strategies. For the Allies, she was not yet a weapon, but she was already a looming problem. They knew her construction marked a shift in the balance of naval power. The launch was not just a spectacle, it was a warning. Within Germany, the Bismarck's launch fueled pride, but also set expectations dangerously high. Crowds celebrated her as unsinkable, believing propaganda that boasted of invulnerability. Sailors dreamed of serving aboard her, imagining glory and victory under her guns. The Kriegsmarine, however, knew the risks, for even the mightiest battleship could be destroyed. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, standing beside Hitler during the launch, saw the Bismarck as both promise and burden. She was powerful enough to threaten Britain, but she was also too valuable to risk lightly. The ship's prestige meant that any failure would be catastrophic for morale and reputation. German industry, strained by rearmament, had invested immense resources in her creation. She had to succeed, for she represented not just a warship but the pride of a nation. The launch bound her to destiny, and destiny rarely forgives failure. After the crowds dispersed, the reality of the work ahead became clear. The hull now afloat was far from complete, lacking engines, weapons, and countless fittings. Over the next year, thousands of workers would continue their labor, installing the turbines, the guns, the fire control systems, and the intricate compartments. Fitting out such a vessel was an immense undertaking, requiring precision and coordination at every level. Naval architects monitored every stage, ensuring the ship met its demanding specifications. By the time she was fully armed and equipped, she would be among the most powerful warships afloat. Yet, even in her unfinished state, the Bismarck captured imaginations. Sailors referred to her with reverence, and dock workers spoke of her as if she were alive. The launch was only the beginning of her story, but it marked the moment when myth began to fuse with reality. The launch of the Bismarck was thus more than an engineering milestone. It was a performance staged for the world, projecting German confidence and daring at the dawn of global conflict. For Hitler, it was proof that Germany had defied Versailles and reclaimed its place among the great naval powers. For the Allies, it was a stark reminder that a new age of naval competition had begun. For the people of Germany, it was an intoxicating symbol of strength after years of weakness. The psychological effect was immense, shaping perceptions even before the ship's first mission. The Bismarck, still incomplete, had already achieved a kind of victory, one of imagination and intimidation. She was not yet a killer, but she was already a legend, and legends once born take on lives of their own. In 1941, the Royal Navy remained the largest fleet in the world, yet its dominance was increasingly stretched thin across the globe. With Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, the sea lanes became its lifeline, the arteries that carried food, fuel, and weapons to sustain the war effort. Every day, convoys ploughed across the Atlantic, braving storms and the relentless menace of German U-boats. The Admiralty understood that without control of these routes, Britain would starve within months. Destroyers, corvettes, and armed trawlers escorted merchantmen, but losses mounted steadily. The Royal Navy still possessed battleships and carriers, but many were aging veterans of World War I. Their crews fought valiantly, but resources were thin, and every ship was needed somewhere else. The Atlantic War was already a desperate contest, even before the Bismarck appeared. Britain's reliance on the sea was absolute, and that vulnerability defined the entire conflict. The fate of the empire was tied to the ocean. The U-boat menace, commanded by Admiral Karl Dönitz, had already inflicted severe damage on Britain's lifelines. By early 1941, wolf packs of submarines prowled the North Atlantic, coordinating attacks on convoys with deadly precision. Sailors spoke of nights lit by burning tankers, of cries in the dark as ships slipped beneath the waves. The Royal Navy responded with sonar, depth charges, and escort groups, but the contest remained finely balanced. Churchill called the Battle of the Atlantic the only campaign that truly frightened him. In this environment, the appearance of a German surface raider like the Bismarck added a new dimension of danger. Submarines could sink ships, but a battleship could annihilate entire convoys in hours. The thought of such a vessel loose on the Atlantic was a nightmare scenario for the Admiralty. It was not merely another ship, it was a predator designed to cripple Britain's survival. The Royal Navy's strength in numbers masked deeper weaknesses. Britain fielded dozens of cruisers and destroyers, but only a handful of modern capital ships remained. The King George V class battleships were still new, their crews untested in full combat. Older vessels like the Hood, the pride of the fleet, carried glory but also vulnerability in their aging designs. Aircraft carriers were in short supply, and many lacked the modern planes needed to strike decisively at long range. The Mediterranean demanded constant attention, with battles raging around Malta and North Africa. The Far East required garrisons to deter Japanese expansion. Everywhere the Royal Navy was present, but nowhere was it truly secure. Against this background, the prospect of the Bismarck emerging onto the Atlantic threatened to tip the scales. Britain's global reach became its weakness. A single German battleship could force the redeployment of fleets from critical theatres. The Bismarck represented not just firepower, but disruption. With her speed of over 30 knots, she could outrun most British battleships and outgun almost any cruiser. Her 8 15-inch guns could obliterate a convoy escort in minutes, leaving merchant ships defenseless. Her thick armour made her nearly impervious to cruiser fire, forcing the Royal Navy to commit its heaviest units to hunt her down. But Britain could not afford to concentrate ships in one place for long. The Admiralty feared that the mere threat of Bismarck would tie down capital ships, weakening other fronts. This was Germany's true strategy, not to destroy the Royal Navy outright, but to stretch it to breaking point. By releasing a single giant, the Kriegsmarine could force Britain into dangerous dilemmas. Every decision became a gamble of risk and resources. Bismarck was more than a ship. She was a strategic weapon of uncertainty. Admiral Raeder and his staff knew the Royal Navy was still stronger, but they also understood Britain's Achilles heel. The Empire's survival depended on uninterrupted trade, and its war machine ran on imported oil, steel, and grain. Germany could not match Britain ship for ship, but it could threaten the arteries that sustained her. U-boats gnawed constantly at these lifelines, but the Bismarck was meant to deliver hammer blows. A single raid could sink hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping, shattering morale and shaking confidence in convoy protection. Raeder believed that even one or two successful operations might tilt the balance of the Atlantic. For Hitler, such victories were as much psychological as strategic, undermining Britain's resolve to fight on. Bismarck's presence was a dagger aimed at Britain's heart. The Admiralty could not ignore her, and that was precisely the point. British intelligence tracked the progress of Bismarck's construction with growing anxiety. Reports filtered in from agents and observers, describing a ship larger and more heavily armed than any German vessel before. Sketches of her silhouette circulated in Admiralty offices, her massive turrets and towering superstructure etched into every officer's mind. War planners debated how to counter her, weighing the risks of sending precious capital ships against a foe designed for destruction. The Hood, King George V, and Prince of Wales were identified as likely opponents, but the danger was clear. If the Bismarck slipped into the Atlantic, she could force Britain into a deadly chase. The Royal Navy was already stretched by convoy escort duties, and diverting major units meant exposing other routes. Every calculation ended in the same conclusion: Bismarck had to be stopped, no matter the cost. She was too dangerous to roam free. The psychological effect of Bismarck's launch and fitting out extended even before her first voyage. British newspapers speculated about the monster ship lurking in German harbours, fueling public anxiety. Sailors in the Royal Navy whispered about her size and her supposed invulnerability, stories exaggerated by rumour but powerful nonetheless. German propaganda ensured that her reputation preceded her, amplifying fear beyond her actual operational record. By early 1941, she had never fired a shot in combat, yet her name was already legendary. This aura of menace gave her immense psychological weight, forcing the Admiralty to plan for worst-case scenarios. The legend of Bismarck became a weapon in itself, influencing strategy before the ship ever set sail. For Britain, the battle had begun long before the guns opened fire. It was a contest of nerves, imagination, and anticipation. And in that arena, Bismarck already held the advantage. Thus, the naval balance of power in 1941 was not determined solely by fleets on paper, but by the pressure of survival. The Royal Navy remained vast, but its responsibilities exceeded its strength, and every convoy carried the fate of the nation. The U-boat menace already strained escorts to the breaking point, and the threat of surface raiders magnified the danger. Into this fragile equilibrium stepped the Bismarck, a ship built to unbalance the scales. She was not intended to defeat the Royal Navy outright, but to force it into impossible choices. In doing so, she magnified Germany's limited naval power into a global problem for Britain. For Churchill and his admirals, her presence was intolerable, for the margin of error was already razor thin. In this sense, the Bismarck was more than a ship. She was a test of Britain's endurance, and that test was about to begin. On May 18, 1941, the Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, slipped quietly from the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, beginning what would be her first and only operational mission. The plan was codenamed Operation Rheinübung, a commerce raiding sortie into the Atlantic intended to cripple Britain's lifeline. At her side sailed the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, smaller but swift and deadly, together forming a powerful striking force. The man entrusted with this mission was Admiral Günther Lütjens, a cautious commander known for discipline but also for loyalty to orders. His task was deceptively simple: break into the Atlantic, attack convoys, and return home victorious. Yet the mission carried immense risk, for the Royal Navy watched every German harbour with hawk-like intensity. Lütjens knew Britain would unleash its entire fleet if Bismarck was discovered. Still, Hitler's orders left little room for hesitation. The stage was set for a naval drama of global consequence. Secrecy was the cornerstone of Rheinübung, for surprise was the only hope of success. The ships sailed under cover of darkness, avoiding coastal traffic and masking their movements with radio silence. The Baltic had been their training ground, but now the open sea awaited. Hundreds of sailors crowded the decks, watching the shoreline fade into the mist. For many, this was their first true taste of war at sea, excitement mingling with foreboding. Below decks, engineers tended the great turbines, coaxing power from the 150,000 horsepower engines. Gunnery crews checked their weapons, adjusting optics and ammunition hoists. The Bismarck carried over 2,200 men, each one aware they were part of history. Prince Eugen's 1,900 sailors added to the force, creating a combined crew of more than 4,000. Together they formed a fleet within a fleet, heading toward the Atlantic with deadly purpose. Admiral Lütjens, though outwardly calm, carried the weight of responsibility like a heavy anchor. He was no gambler. Unlike his subordinate, Captain Ernst Lindemann, the Bismarck's commanding officer, who yearned to unleash his ship's guns in battle. Lütjens, however, had witnessed the carnage of earlier sorties, where surface raiders like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had been hunted relentlessly by the Royal Navy. His orders were strict: avoid unnecessary engagements, focus on destroying convoys, and preserve the ships at all costs. Yet deep down, he knew the odds were stacked against them. The Royal Navy had more ships, more bases, and better reconnaissance. Every mile westward, increased the danger of detection by British patrols or aircraft. Still, discipline demanded he obey Berlin's command. For Lütjen's, duty outweighed doubt, and the Bismarck sailed onward. The first challenge of Rheinübung was geography itself. To reach the Atlantic, the German ships had to slip past the narrow waters of Denmark and Norway. British forces patrolled these routes constantly, and reconnaissance flights searched for any sign of German activity. On May 21st, Bismarck and Prince Eugen anchored in Grimstad Fjord near Bergen, Norway, taking on supplies and giving sailors a final glimpse of land. The fjord's calm waters mirrored the grey hulls, a deceptive tranquility masking the storm ahead. Norwegian civilians, watching from the shore, glimpsed the battleship's towering silhouette, their whispers soon reaching Allied ears. British intelligence, already alert, took notice of the movement. In London, the Admiralty began to piece together fragments of information. The hunt had not yet begun, but suspicion was already in the air. Time was running out for secrecy. From Bergen, the German task force prepared to enter the perilous waters of the North Atlantic. Fuel was topped off, and camouflage patterns were painted to confuse enemy spotters. Yet even as preparations continued, British reconnaissance aircraft sighted the ships, snapping photographs of Bismarck at anchor. Lütjens ordered an immediate departure, aware that the veil of secrecy was torn. The task now was speed and evasion, to reach the open sea before the Royal Navy closed in. Engines roared to life as the massive battleship churned the fjord's waters, followed closely by Prince Eugen. The sailors, now fully aware they had been spotted, tightened their resolve. The mood aboard shifted from anticipation to grim determination. The Atlantic was vast, but the net was already tightening. Rheinübung was entering its most dangerous phase. As Bismarck steamed north toward the Denmark Strait, the sailors settled into the routines of war. Lookouts scanned the horizon day and night, searching for enemy ships or aircraft. Gunnery drills continued, with turrets traversing in unison, their barrels elevating toward the sky. Below decks, stokers and machinists worked in sweltering heat, keeping the turbines running at peak efficiency. Officers plotted courses designed to exploit gaps in British patrol patterns. Meals were eaten quickly, often interrupted by alarms or drills. In the mess halls, young sailors joked nervously, masking fear with bravado. Letters written but never sent sat in pockets and lockers, silent testaments to the uncertainty of survival. Life aboard the Bismarck was both routine and extraordinary, a mixture of daily chores and looming danger. Every hour brought them closer to the Atlantic and to destiny. The Prince Eugen, though overshadowed by her massive companion, was a formidable warship in her own right. Displacing 18,000 tons, armed with 8 8-inch guns, and capable of 32 knots, she had already proven her value as a commerce raider. Her crew, seasoned and confident, regarded the mission with cautious optimism. Paired with Bismarck, she provided both speed and striking power, a perfect partner for the dangerous voyage. Together, the two ships formed a wolf pack of steel, capable of ravaging Allied convoys in the mid-Atlantic. Yet the Royal Navy understood this danger well, and its patrols were ever vigilant. In London, signals intelligence began to track German movements, piecing together clues with growing clarity. The clash of fleets was now inevitable. Every mile west brought Bismarck closer to confrontation, and every mile west drew Britain closer to crisis. Operation Rheinübung had begun in secrecy, but it was already evolving into a high-stakes pursuit. For the Kriegsmarine, success meant cutting Britain's lifeline and proving Germany's surface fleet could still strike fear into the Atlantic. For the Royal Navy, it meant preventing catastrophe, no matter the cost in ships or men. The Bismarck was not yet in battle, but her very presence had already shifted the balance of the war at sea. Sailors aboard her decks felt the weight of expectation pressing down with every rolling wave. Admiral Lütjens, bound by orders and fate, guided his fleet toward the open ocean. The Atlantic awaited, a vast expanse that offered both opportunity and peril. In Berlin, leaders dreamed of glory. In London, commanders braced for disaster. And in the cold waters of the Denmark Strait, destiny prepared its stage. By late May 1941, British intelligence had begun to close the net around the German raiders. Reconnaissance aircraft sighted suspicious movements, while signals intercepts confirmed the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen were heading for the North Atlantic. The Admiralty acted with urgency, dispatching every available unit to intercept. Convoys were rerouted, and capital ships left their stations to converge on the likely escape routes. The most dangerous of these was the Denmark Strait, a narrow, ice-choked passage between Greenland and Iceland. If the Germans slipped through, they would have access to the open Atlantic, where convoys sailed with minimal escort. The British could not allow this to happen, for the consequences would be catastrophic. In London, Churchill himself demanded that the Bismarck be found and destroyed at all costs. The chase had become a matter of national survival. Every hour narrowed the gap between hunter and hunted. The Royal Navy dispatched a powerful force northward to block the Denmark Strait. Leading the group was HMS Hood, the pride of the fleet and the symbol of British sea power. Launched in 1918, she was the largest warship in the world, stretching 262 meters and armed with 8 15-inch guns. To the British public, Hood was invincible, the embodiment of imperial strength and prestige. Alongside her sailed HMS Prince of Wales, one of the newest King George V-class battleships, still fresh from the shipyard. Though not yet fully tested, she carried 10 14-inch guns and the hope of modern naval design. Rear Admiral Lancelot Holland commanded the force, tasked with intercepting Bismarck before she broke free into the Atlantic. The sight of Hood and Prince of Wales steaming north inspired confidence among their crews. They believed they were about to stop Germany's greatest warship. The stage was set for confrontation. On board Hood, sailors prepared for action with a mixture of pride and unease. She was a legend, but she was also a veteran. Her armor thinner than modern designs, and her vulnerabilities well known to naval architects. Her crew numbered more than 1,400 men, many young and eager who trusted their ship's reputation more than its aging steel. In the mess decks, men spoke in hushed tones about facing the Bismarck, whose name had already become myth. On the Prince of Wales, things were different. Her crew included many dockyard workers and trainees, brought aboard to help with systems still being worked out. Some guns had not been fully tested, and breakdowns were common. Yet there was no time for hesitation, for orders demanded pursuit. Both ships steamed at full speed into the cold grey waters of the Denmark Strait. The clash ahead would be sudden and unforgiving. Every man aboard felt it in his bones. The weather in the Denmark Strait was as hostile as the enemy. Fog banks drifted across the sea, and icebergs loomed on the horizon like silent sentinels. Bitter winds whipped the decks, and freezing spray coated gun barrels and railings. Visibility came and went in sudden shifts, offering brief glimpses before swallowing ships in grey mist. For lookouts, the strain was immense, eyes scanning endlessly for silhouettes against the horizon. Radar offered some assistance, but its range was limited, and the sea cluttered with false echoes. The German ships too relied on weather for cover, slipping between patches of fog to mask their course. It was a battle not only between fleets, but also against nature itself. The North Atlantic was merciless, and it gave no quarter to friend or foe. Into this harsh theatre, the hunters and hunted drew ever closer. On board the Bismarck, Admiral Lütjens knew that contact was inevitable. British patrols had already shadowed his force, and reports made it clear the Royal Navy was closing in. His orders forbade unnecessary battle, but avoiding the British was no longer possible. Captain Ernst Lindemann urged decisive action, confident in Bismarck's power and eager to unleash her guns. Lütjens, ever cautious, weighed the risks, knowing the mission depended on preserving the ship. Prince Eugen, with her lighter armament, was placed ahead to scout and engage as needed. Bismarck's crew, drilled for weeks, prepared their turrets, loaded shells and manned stations. Below decks, engineers braced for full-speed maneuvers, keeping the great turbines roaring. The German sailors, like their British counterparts, felt the tension rising with each passing hour. A clash was coming, and they knew it would be brutal. British intelligence continued to track the German force, though uncertainty remained. Aircraft sightings were intermittent, and fog made shadowing difficult. Yet enough information reached Admiral Holland to set his course with determination. Hood and Prince of Wales surged forward, their wakes trailing like swords through the icy water. The Admiralty's orders were clear: engage and destroy Bismarck before she reached the Atlantic. In London, Churchill's command echoed across the fleet: sink the Bismarck. For sailors, the words carried both inspiration and dread. To sink such a ship would be a triumph, but to face her guns was to invite annihilation. In the Denmark Strait, the two sides now moved along converging courses. The collision of steel giants was only hours away. The men aboard Hood looked toward the horizon, knowing they were about to test their ship's reputation against a modern monster. Memories of Jutland lingered in the Royal Navy, where battle cruisers had been lost to plunging fire from German guns. Hood, despite her size, carried the same design flaw: thin deck armor vulnerable to long-range shells. Prince of Wales, modern but untested, was plagued by technical difficulties, with gunners reporting jams even during exercises. Yet none of this mattered, as orders came down to prepare for action. Shells were loaded into hoists, powder charges readied, and turrets swung into position. Damage control parties checked fire hoses, bulkheads, and medical kits. In the freezing wind, crews donned helmets and life jackets, bracing for what lay ahead. They knew Bismarck was close, and they knew history would be written in the hours to come. As night fell on May 23rd, British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk shadowed the German force, exchanging radar reports with Hood and Prince of Wales. The Germans knew they were being followed, their every move relayed to Admiralty headquarters. Lütjens ordered evasive maneuvers, but the shadowers held their distance, always reappearing on radar. The cat-and-mouse game could not last, for by dawn the two sides would meet face to face. The crews of both navies spent the night in readiness, their nerves stretched tight by the weight of expectation. In London, the Admiralty waited anxiously for word of battle. On the grey waters of the Denmark Strait, destiny gathered in silence. The clash between legend and giant was inevitable, and soon the guns would speak. At 5:37 a.m. on May 24th, 1941, the cold silence of the Denmark Strait shattered as lookouts aboard Hood sighted smoke on the horizon. The British force, led by Rear Admiral Holland, had intercepted the German raiders at last. Visibility was poor, with patches of fog and low clouds obscuring the sea, but the silhouettes of Bismarck and Prince Eugen soon loomed into view. Orders rang out aboard Hood and Prince of Wales as battle stations were manned with disciplined urgency. Crews braced themselves at their guns, knowing the clash would decide more than just the fate of two ships. It would shape the battle for the Atlantic. Holland, aboard Hood, signalled to open fire once in range. At 5:52 a.m., Hood unleashed her first salvo, her massive 15-inch guns roaring across the sea. Shells arced through the morning gloom, streaking toward the German line. The Battle of the Denmark Strait had begun. The opening salvos fell short, geysers of seawater erupting near Prinz Eugen's bow. The Germans responded instantly, their gunners swift and precise, aiming first at Hood, the larger and more threatening target. Prinz Eugen's 8-inch guns found their mark quickly, striking Hood amidships and igniting fires near the boat deck. Smoke and flames billowed as damage control parties rushed to contain the blaze. Bismarck's massive 15-inch guns then entered the fray, their thunderous blasts shaking the ship's entire frame. German shells landed closer and closer, each salvo walking in toward Hood's vulnerable deck. On Hood's bridge, officers urged more speed to close the distance, knowing their thin deck armor was dangerously exposed at long range. Admiral Holland hoped to reduce that danger by cutting across the German line. Yet time was not on his side. The Germans had found their range with deadly efficiency. Prince of Wales joined the battle, her new and untested guns thundering in reply. Her salvos splashed around Bismarck, one shell striking the giant and tearing into her forward compartments. But the Prince's gunnery was plagued by mechanical failures, turrets jammed, misfires disrupted rhythm, and shells fell erratically. Still, her presence divided the Germans' fire, forcing them to split attention. On Hood, the fires spread as German shells continued to land with punishing accuracy. Sailors battled the blazes, even as more shells rained down, fragments and splinters cutting through decks and compartments. Hood's great hull shuddered under the pounding, but her guns roared defiantly. Her crew of 1,400 fought with determination, clinging to the ship's reputation as the mighty Hood. Yet beneath the legend lay the stark reality of outdated armor. The battle was tilting toward disaster. At 5:55 a.m., just 3 minutes after opening fire, Bismarck's gunners struck a devastating blow. A shell from her fifth salvo found its way through Hood's thin deck armor near the aft magazines. For a heartbeat there was silence, and then the sea erupted in unimaginable violence. Hood's stern vanished in a colossal fireball as the magazines detonated, hurling steel and flames skyward in a pillar of destruction. The explosion split the great battlecruiser in two, her bow rising briefly before plunging beneath the waves. In less than 3 minutes the pride of the Royal Navy was gone. Of her crew of over 1,400 men, only 3 survived the inferno and freezing waters. Sailors aboard Prince of Wales and the German ships alike watched in stunned silence at the suddenness of the catastrophe. The invincible Hood had perished in an instant. The shock of Hood's destruction reverberated across the British fleet and around the world. On Prince of Wales, officers barely had time to absorb the horror before the German guns turned their fury upon them. Bismarck and Prince Eugen focused salvos on the young battleship, their shells smashing into her superstructure. Fires erupted, bulkheads collapsed, and gunners were cut down at their stations. Still, Prince of Wales fought back, her crew grimly determined to avenge Hood. Despite turret failures, several of her shells struck home, one penetrating Bismarck's forward oil tanks. The hit caused flooding and left the battleship trailing a long slick of fuel across the sea. Though not crippling, it would force Bismarck to slow her mission and seek repairs. The young British battleship had wounded the giant, but she too was bleeding from every deck. Captain John Leach of Prince of Wales faced a terrible choice as his ship absorbed more damage. With Hood destroyed and his own ship suffering severe hits, remaining in the fight meant certain destruction. At 6:09 a.m., He reluctantly ordered a turn away, laying a smokescreen to cover withdrawal. His crew, devastated by Hood's loss, obeyed with bitter reluctance. Even as they pulled back, Prince of Wales fired defiant parting salvos, one of which struck Bismarck's bridge structure. A German officer was killed, and Admiral Lütjens himself was nearly hit by fragments. Yet the retreat was unavoidable. Survival was the only option. Prince of Wales limped away into the mist, battered but alive. The battle was over as suddenly as it had begun. In its wake lay the wreck of the Hood and the fury of a nation. For the Germans, the victory was both triumph and problem. They had destroyed the most famous ship in the Royal Navy, but Bismarck had been wounded in the process. The oil slick betrayed her position, making concealment nearly impossible. Lütjens knew the damage meant his mission to raid Atlantic convoys was compromised. Instead of opportunity, he now faced pursuit by the full might of the Royal Navy. On board, sailors cheered the destruction of Hood, their confidence soaring, yet officers recognized the danger of lingering in northern waters. Prince Eugen was ordered to continue commerce raiding, while Bismarck plotted a course toward occupied France for repairs. What had begun as triumph was already shifting toward desperation. The chase was about to intensify. The Battle of the Denmark Strait lasted less than 20 minutes, but its consequences were immense. Britain had lost its greatest warship and over 1,400 men in a single catastrophic blow. Yet the Royal Navy's resolve only hardened, with Churchill vowing that Bismarck must be hunted down at all costs. For Germany, the battle proved the power of their battleship, but also exposed her vulnerability. The hits from Prince of Wales forced her into a defensive strategy, turning victory into a perilous retreat. Across the North Atlantic, ships scrambled to intercept, forming a vast net of steel and determination. The Hood was gone, but her loss ignited a fire of vengeance. The battle had ended, but the hunt had only begun, and in that pursuit, destiny awaited the Bismarck. When the first reports of the Denmark Strait battle reached London on May 24, 1941, disbelief gripped the Admiralty. The Hood, the symbol of Britain's naval supremacy, had vanished in a single cataclysmic explosion. Initial signals were fragmentary, describing a violent engagement, a sudden detonation, and only a handful of survivors. Officers stared at the dispatches in stunned silence, unable to comprehend that the Royal Navy's pride was gone. Within hours, confirmation arrived. Hood had sunk with over 1,400 men aboard. It was the worst single loss of life in the history of the British fleet. News spread quickly through Whitehall, rippling outward into the press, Parliament, and the public. Britain, already strained by years of war, was shaken to its core. The mighty Hood, invincible in the public imagination, had been destroyed in minutes. For a nation that lived by the sea, it was a wound that cut deep. In the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill reacted with fury and grief. He demanded immediate updates, pressing his admirals for a clear plan to avenge Hood. In his gravelly voice, he issued the order that would echo across history: sink the Bismarck. It was not a suggestion but a command, a directive that every ship, every plane, and every sailor in the Royal Navy would carry in their hearts. The Prime Minister understood the psychological stakes. If Britain could not avenge Hood, the nation's faith in its fleet might collapse. Churchill, himself a former First Lord of the Admiralty, felt the loss personally, knowing what the ship represented to Britain's people. Hood had been more than steel and guns. She had been hope, pride, and deterrent. Her destruction demanded an answer, swift and absolute. The hunt for Bismarck became a matter of honor as much as survival. Across Britain, the news broke like a thunderclap. Newspapers carried headlines in bold type: Hood lost. Over 1,400 dead. Families wept openly in streets and churches, many realizing their sons, brothers, or fathers were among the missing. Cinemas fell silent as newsreels announced the tragedy, audiences gasping in disbelief. For a population already enduring the Blitz, rationing, and nightly blackouts, the loss of Hood felt like a personal blow. The ship had visited ports across the Empire in the interwar years, leaving lasting memories of her majesty and power. Now those memories turned to mourning. Ordinary Britons spoke of revenge, demanding that Bismarck be destroyed at any cost. The government, sensing the public mood, emphasized Churchill's words in every broadcast. Hood's death became a rallying cry. Out of grief, determination was born. The Royal Navy's officers and sailors felt the loss most acutely. Hood had been their flagship, the embodiment of the fleet's fighting tradition since the First World War. Many had trained aboard her, or sailed in her shadow during parades and exercises. To see her obliterated so swiftly shook the very core of their confidence. Yet with the shock came grim resolve. In wardrooms and mess decks across the fleet, sailors repeated Churchill's command like a mantra: sink the Bismarck. Morale, though wounded, hardened into iron determination. Every man understood that the Royal Navy's reputation was now at stake. They would hunt the German battleship across the Atlantic if necessary. Failure was unthinkable. For the Germans, the destruction of Hood was celebrated as a triumph. Propaganda broadcasts announced the victory, boasting that Bismarck had humbled Britain's greatest warship. In Berlin, Nazi officials heralded the battle as proof of German superiority at sea. Yet even amid the celebrations, Admiral Lütjens remained cautious aboard Bismarck. He knew his ship had been damaged, trailing oil across the waves, and the Royal Navy would never forgive the loss of Hood. His orders to press onward into the Atlantic now seemed increasingly dangerous. Every hour brought reports of British ships converging from all directions. What had begun as a victory was rapidly becoming a perilous retreat. The Germans had struck a blow, but in doing so they had awakened a giant. Inside the Admiralty's map room in London, the scale of the crisis was laid bare. Red markers showed the last known position of Bismarck and Prinz Eugen, while blue counters marked British ships racing to intercept. Cruisers from the home fleet, battleships from Scapa Flow, and aircraft carriers from distant stations all converged like predators on the scent of prey. Signals flashed across the Atlantic, coordinating movements in real time as intelligence reports narrowed the chase. Admirals debated strategy, weighing fuel limits, weather conditions, and the risks of interception. But all arguments circled back to Churchill's command. There was no alternative but to bring Bismarck down. The atmosphere crackled with urgency, every decision made with the knowledge that Britain's honour was on the line. The shock of Hood's loss had been transformed into a relentless pursuit. For the sailors at sea, the order carried a personal weight. Men aboard King George V, Ark Royal, and Rodney spoke of Hood with reverence, many recalling seeing her proud silhouette in peacetime harbours. Now they vowed vengeance for her fallen crew. In mess halls, mugs slammed on tables as men swore oaths of retribution. Gunners cleaned their weapons with meticulous care, determined to avenge the thousands lost. Pilots aboard carriers prepared for missions that might never return, but their resolve was unshaken. Even the youngest recruits felt the gravity of the task before them. Hood's death had burned away hesitation. What remained was determination, unyielding, unforgiving, and absolute across the fleet. A single thought united them all: the Bismarck must die. Thus the loss of Hood sent shockwaves through Britain and the world. For the Royal Navy, it was both tragedy and catalyst, a wound that demanded immediate retribution. For Churchill, it became a rallying cry that galvanized every resource of the empire. For the German sailors, it was a fleeting triumph that masked the peril closing in. The destruction of Hood had altered the psychology of the Atlantic War, transforming it into a personal vendetta. The hunt for Bismarck was no longer a mission of strategy, but one of honor and survival. Across the North Atlantic, steel giants converged on their prey. Hood's wreck lay silent on the ocean floor, but her spirit drove the fleet onward. The shadow of her loss stretched across the waves, and in that shadow the Royal Navy prepared to strike back. In the moments after Hood's destruction, cheers echoed across Bismarck's decks, but the jubilation was short-lived. Deep within her hull, engineers reported ominous flooding in the forward compartments. A shell from Prince of Wales had torn into her bows, rupturing oil tanks and letting seawater surge through bulkheads. The damage was not catastrophic, but it was crippling, leaving a trail of fuel slick across the cold Atlantic waters. To the naked eye, Bismarck still looked invincible, her guns silent and smoke trailing only faintly. Yet the oil gushed steadily, marking her path like blood from a wounded predator. Admiral Lütjens realized that secrecy, their greatest advantage, had been lost. Every aircraft or ship that crossed the Atlantic would now see the spreading stain. The hunter had been transformed into prey. Bismarck was powerful, but she was no longer invisible. Lütjens faced an agonizing decision in those hours after the battle. His mission had been to break into the Atlantic and strike at Britain's vital convoys. Yet with his ship bleeding fuel, extended operations became impossible. Prince Eugen, unscathed and still brimming with ammunition, remained fully capable of commerce raiding. To preserve some shred of Rheinübung's original purpose, Lütjens ordered the cruiser to detach and continue alone. At dawn on May 24th, Prince Eugen turned southward into the mist, her silhouette vanishing into the grey seas. Captain Helmuth Brinkmann and his crew were left to their fate, raiders without their giant guardian. For the men aboard Bismarck, the separation was a somber moment. They had lost their partner, and the great battleship was now alone in hostile waters. The mission had already been reduced to survival. Captain Ernst Lindemann, ever the fighting spirit, argued that Bismarck still had the strength to continue offensive operations. Her main guns were intact, her speed only slightly reduced, and her crew remained eager for battle. But Lütjens, a veteran of surface raids, saw the broader reality. He knew the Royal Navy was already hunting them with relentless purpose. Every convoy they might attack would be bait for British warships lying in wait. Worse still, the oil leak threatened their ability to maneuver freely across the ocean. Lindemann's pride clashed with Lütjens' caution, yet duty demanded obedience to orders. The decision was made to abandon the commerce raiding role entirely. Instead, Bismarck would steer for occupied France, where dry docks could repair her wounds. The Predator was retreating, though not without defiance. Survival now took precedence over glory. Below decks, the engineers worked furiously to contain the flooding. Pumps roared as men in oil-slicked uniforms struggled to patch ruptured tanks and reinforce bulkheads. The stench of fuel filled the air, making breathing difficult and causing eyes to burn. Every effort bought the ship more time, but the damage could not be undone at sea. Bismarck's bow rode slightly lower, pounding against the waves as she surged forward. The pounding seas made repairs nearly impossible, washing over decks and cascading into open compartments. Sailors spoke in hushed voices about the endless stream of oil trailing behind them. Some knew it was as dangerous as a blood trail to a wounded animal in the wild. Above, the officers scanned the skies, expecting aircraft to appear at any moment. The Predator was strong, but it was bleeding, and the ocean betrayed her secret. On the bridge, Lutyens drafted new orders and signaled Berlin, reporting Hood's destruction but also Bismarck's condition. The message, though triumphant in tone, carried an undercurrent of unease. Naval Command praised the victory, but quickly grasped the implications of the damage. The Reich now had a choice: risk Bismarck in further battle, or preserve her as a fleet in being. Hitler, obsessed with prestige, demanded the ship be saved at all costs. The French Atlantic ports, particularly Saint-Nazaire, offered refuge, but they lay hundreds of perilous miles away. To reach them, Bismarck would have to cross waters dominated by British patrols and shadowing cruisers. Every mile was a gamble against detection and destruction. The great battleship's fate was now tethered to the long voyage south. One wrong move would spell doom. For the crew, the mood shifted from exultation to grim determination. The victory over Hood had filled them with pride, but now the oil slick and constant alarms gnawed at their confidence. Sailors patched, pumped, and bailed, as if wrestling with the ocean itself. The gunners, still flush with adrenaline, stood ready, knowing another battle was inevitable. The medical staff tended to the wounded, their bunks echoing with the groans of men burned or shattered by shrapnel. In the mess halls, conversations turned from triumph to speculation about survival. The men whispered about the Royal Navy's vengeance, about Churchill's command to sink their ship at any cost. Yet discipline remained ironclad, forged by weeks of training and the authority of their officers. They were the crew of the Bismarck, and duty demanded endurance, but each man felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on his soul. Meanwhile, British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk continued to shadow the German giant from a cautious distance. Their radar locked onto the fleeing ship, relaying constant updates to the Admiralty. Bismarck's oil trail made concealment impossible, and the shadowers never lost contact. Admiral Lutyens attempted evasive maneuvers, but the cruisers always reappeared on the edge of vision. The Royal Navy's net was tightening, drawing in battleships, carriers, and destroyers from across the Atlantic. Every transmission carried by radio and radar guided the hunters closer. Lutyens, realizing he could not shake his pursuers, shifted focus to reaching safety before the trap closed. His crew, exhausted but vigilant, prepared for the next clash. The Predator was still deadly, but her movements were bound by the wounds she carried. The chase had become a race against time. Thus, the Bismarck, once hunter, now sailed as prey across the storm-lashed Atlantic. Her guns remained ready, her crew unbroken, but the wound in her side betrayed her with every passing mile. Admiral Lutyens' decision to detach Prinz Eugen preserved the cruiser, but left the battleship isolated and vulnerable. The voyage south toward France became a gauntlet, every wave and cloud hiding the threat of enemy eyes. The Royal Navy, spurred by vengeance for Hood, was converging with overwhelming force. Bismarck's officers knew the next engagement was inevitable, and likely final. For the German sailors, the days ahead would test courage beyond measure. The Predator's roar still echoed across the ocean, but the scent of blood was unmistakable, and the hunters were closing in with relentless determination. The sinking of Hood transformed the pursuit of Bismarck into the largest naval hunt of the Second World War. In London, Churchill's command, "Sink the Bismarck," was not rhetorical but operational, igniting the Admiralty into furious action. Every available warship, from battleships to destroyers, was ordered into the Atlantic. Signal lamps flashed across harbors, steam boilers roared to life, and crews scrambled aboard with haste. From Scapa Flow in the north to Gibraltar in the south, the Royal Navy surged outward like a net tightening around prey. The scope of the mobilization was immense, involving over 50 warships in coordinated pursuit. It was a gamble of scale, for to find and sink Bismarck meant stripping resources from other theaters. Yet the loss of Hood demanded vengeance beyond calculation. Britain would commit everything it had, even at great risk elsewhere. The greatest naval hunt in history was underway. At Scapa Flow, the home fleet flagship HMS King George V, commanded by Admiral Sir John Tovey, raised anchor with urgency. The battleship, armed with 10 14-inch guns, carried both the firepower and prestige to lead the chase. Alongside her sailed the veteran HMS Rodney, an older but powerful battleship bristling with 9 16-inch guns. Though slower and plagued by mechanical issues, Rodney was a floating fortress, her guns capable of smashing through Bismarck's thick armor. Supporting them were destroyers tasked with screening against U-boats and providing torpedo attacks if opportunity arose. The sight of the great battleships steaming into the grey seas galvanized morale among their crews. Men whispered about Hood's loss, but their determination hardened with each pounding wave. Admiral Tovey knew time was against him. Bismarck was racing for France, yet he also knew Britain's survival hinged on this pursuit. His orders were unequivocal: intercept at all costs. From Gibraltar, Force H, under Admiral James Somerville, prepared to join the chase. At its heart was the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, her decks lined with Swordfish torpedo bombers. Though obsolete biplanes, their slow speed made them deadly against armoured battleships, giving the Royal Navy a long-range striking hand. Ark Royal was flanked by the battlecruiser HMS Renown, a veteran of the Norwegian campaign, and the cruiser HMS Sheffield. This southern force would cut off any attempt by Bismarck to reach French ports from below. The crews of Ark Royal's Swordfish squadrons trained feverishly as the ships steamed north, rehearsing attacks that might decide the battle. Pilots sharpened their instincts, knowing their fragile planes might be the only chance to cripple the German giant. The stakes were immense, for if Bismarck reached Brest or Saint Nazaire, she could return to menace the Atlantic again. Somerville's orders were clear: intercept, engage, and cripple. Further west, the cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk continued their shadowing role, relying on radar in the dense fog. They trailed Bismarck at a cautious distance, feeding constant updates back to the Admiralty. Their task was dangerous, for one direct hit from Bismarck's 15-inch guns could obliterate them. Yet they persisted, darting in and out of visibility, always reappearing on the edge of the horizon. The strain on their crews was immense, nerves stretched thin by the knowledge that discovery meant destruction. Radar operators sat rigid at their screens, hearts pounding with every faint echo. Their reports became the lifeline of the entire pursuit, guiding battleships and carriers converging from every direction. Without them, the hunt would dissolve into blind searching across a vast ocean. With them, the Royal Navy maintained its grip on the trail. The shadowers played the most dangerous game of all. Across the Atlantic, reinforcements surged into motion. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, the USS Wasp and other American vessels quietly prepared to support, though the United States remained officially neutral. In Iceland, British forces readied additional cruisers and destroyers to patrol the Denmark Strait. From the Mediterranean, messages ordered vigilance against any German breakout attempt in other waters. Even the Soviet Union, still bound by its uneasy pact with Germany, observed the developments with silent interest. The scale of coordination was global, with naval intelligence piecing together a mosaic of reports. Wireless operators tapped furiously as coded signals leapt from ship to ship, synchronizing the hunt across thousands of miles. For many sailors, the pursuit felt less like a mission and more like destiny. Each vessel played its part in the unfolding drama, a vast cast in a maritime theatre. The Royal Navy had never moved with such collective urgency. The Admiralty's map room in London became the nerve centre of the pursuit. Admirals, intelligence officers, and Churchill himself studied a giant chart covered in pins and strings. Red markers indicated Bismarck's last known position, while blue markers traced the converging British fleets. Every hour the positions shifted, the map alive with movement like a great chessboard of steel. Staff officers calculated fuel ranges, estimated interception times, and weighed the risks of U-boat ambushes. Reports from Suffolk and Norfolk provided the rhythm of the chase, each update tightening the noose. Churchill visited frequently, his presence adding gravity to every decision. He reminded his officers that the eyes of the world were watching, and failure was not an option. The map was more than a chart. It was the beating heart of Britain's survival. Each pin represented ships, crews, and the hope of vengeance. The hunt consumed every waking hour. At sea, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. Sailors on destroyers sharpened torpedoes and loaded depth charges, preparing for a chance to strike. Battleship crews drilled at their guns, practicing rapid salvos for the inevitable clash. Carrier pilots briefed and rebriefed, poring over maps of the Atlantic, rehearsing attacks against a foe they had not yet seen. The sea itself added to the tension, waves crashing against hulls as storms brewed across the cold waters. Men shivered in oilskins, bracing against the spray, their thoughts never far from the hood. Rumours spread through mess decks, stories of Bismarck's invulnerability, of Hood's instant destruction, of Churchill's furious command. Each tale fed the determination to fight harder, to prove that the Royal Navy was not broken. Across thousands of miles, sailors felt bound together by one mission. The hunt unified them as nothing else could. Vengeance carried them forward on the wind. Thus began the greatest naval pursuit in modern history. From the icy north to the storm-lashed mid-Atlantic, Britain's warships surged like wolves closing on a wounded stag. The loss of Hood had triggered not despair, but a mobilization of staggering scale. Every ship, every aircraft, and every sailor carried the same unshakable resolve. Bismarck must not escape. For the Germans the challenge was survival, for every hour at sea brought more hunters into the chase. For the British the chase was more than strategy, it was vengeance, honor, and survival bound together. The net was cast wide, and the ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. In the coming days, storms, shadows, and steel would decide the fate of the Atlantic. The hunters had been unleashed, and the world watched as the trap closed in on Bismarck. As dawn broke on May 24th, 1941, two British heavy cruisers found themselves holding the most dangerous assignment of the hunt. HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk, both county-class vessels, had intercepted Bismarck and Prince Eugen during their dash through the Denmark Strait. Outgunned and out-armoured, the cruisers stood no chance in a direct fight against the German battleship. Yet their role was not to engage, but to shadow, to cling like shadows to the predator's flank. Suffolk carried a crucial advantage: Type 284 radar, one of the most advanced sets in the Royal Navy. In the fog and snow squalls of the Strait, it gave the British eyes where the Germans had none. Radar operators leaned over glowing screens, tracing faint echoes that betrayed Bismarck's movements. Each reading was sent by radio back to the Admiralty, guiding the great fleet now closing in. The cruisers had become the hunter's eyes. The tension aboard Suffolk and Norfolk was electric, for they knew discovery meant destruction. Bismarck's 8 15-inch guns could obliterate them with a single accurate salvo. Officers ordered the cruisers to remain at extreme range, hovering just outside the envelope of German fire. Their silhouettes appeared and vanished with the fog, like ghosts in the grey seas. Lookouts strained their eyes through binoculars, scanning for flashes that would herald incoming fire. At night they dared not use searchlights, relying instead on radar to maintain contact. Every transmission they sent risked revealing their own position, but the need for coordination outweighed the danger. Messages tapped furiously through wireless sets became lifelines for the rest of the fleet. It was a delicate balance of nerve, discipline, and technology. The cruiser's survival depended on invisibility. Bismarck's crew soon realized they were being followed. Lookouts spotted faint shapes on the horizon, sometimes lost in the mist, but always returning. Admiral Lütjens, already uneasy with the oil leak, understood the danger of constant shadowing. He ordered evasive maneuvers, zigzagging through fog banks, hoping to shake the persistent pursuers. Captain Ernst Lindemann grew frustrated, urging that Bismarck turn her guns on the smaller ships and destroy them. Yet Lütjens resisted, unwilling to waste ammunition or risk damage in a fight that did not serve their escape. Instead, Bismarck surged forward at bursts of high speed, her turbines roaring with all the power her engineers could muster. The great battleship cut through the waves like a predator seeking freedom, but behind her, Suffolk and Norfolk clung with tenacity, their radar beams sweeping the horizon. The shadowing game continued, tense and unforgiving. On Suffolk, radar operators worked in near darkness, the hum of the equipment filling the small compartment. Every faint blip of light represented not just a ship, but the hopes of Britain itself. Operators tracked Bismarck's bearing and range with painstaking accuracy, logging every turn and course change. Their voices were calm but taut as they relayed data to the bridge, where officers plotted the German battleship's movements on charts. The information was transmitted to the Admiralty and to pursuing warships like King George V and Rodney. Each signal sent across the ether shortened the net around the fleeing giant. For the men in the radar room, there was no glory, only the burden of precision under unimaginable pressure. They knew a single mistake could lose the trail, yet their concentration never wavered. In that darkened room, the fate of the chase rested. Meanwhile, on Norfolk, the tension among the gunners was nearly unbearable. They stood ready at their stations, knowing they might be ordered to fight at any moment. Ammunition lay ready in hoists, powder charges stacked in magazines, turrets traversed to cover arcs of fire. The men understood that their 8-inch shells were pebbles against Bismarck's fortress-like armor, yet they also knew that one hit from the German giant could tear their ship apart in seconds. Smoke from Bismarck's funnels sometimes drifted across the horizon, a reminder of the predator they stalked. Officers reassured their men that shadowing was their only duty, not suicidal combat. Still, sailors whispered prayers as they scanned the grey horizon. They knew the line between shadow and prey was perilously thin. Courage meant holding station, no matter the risk. The cat-and-mouse game stretched across the endless sea, day bleeding into night, with little respite. Fog rolled in thick waves, sometimes hiding Bismarck completely, sometimes revealing her massive silhouette. Suffolk and Norfolk adjusted course relentlessly, keeping their quarry just within radar range. Radio operators tapped out constant position reports, each one feeding the vast network of pursuing ships. Admiral Tovey, in King George V, relied on those updates to bring his battleships into striking distance. Ark Royal's Swordfish squadrons prepared for attacks based on the cruiser's signals. The weight of responsibility pressed down on the crews of Suffolk and Norfolk like an anchor. Their mission demanded invisibility but absolute persistence. Every hour of contact was another hour closer to interception. The chase became a battle of endurance. For Bismarck's crew, The shadowers became a source of constant frustration and anxiety. Gunners remained at their stations, scanning the horizon for the elusive cruisers. Searchlights were forbidden, for they would betray the battleship's position to the world. The oil slick trailing in her wake made concealment nearly impossible, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Officers debated whether to turn and fight, but Lutyens refused, convinced it would waste precious time. Instead, the ship pressed onward, her course bent toward the safety of occupied France. Sailors cursed the unseen pursuers, their nerves fraying under the strain of being hunted. Each night watch stretched endlessly, haunted by the knowledge that the British were out there, just beyond the mist. Fatigue spread through the crew, but discipline held firm. The Predator sailed on, but the shadows clung relentlessly. Thus the shadowing phase became one of the most critical chapters in the Bismarck saga. Suffolk and Norfolk, fragile compared to the Leviathan they tracked, fulfilled their duty with extraordinary discipline and resolve. Their radar and wireless reports transformed the hunt from chaos into a coordinated pursuit. Without them, the Royal Navy's great fleet would have been blind across the vast Atlantic. With them, the hunters closed the distance hour by hour. The tension of those days was less about gunfire and more about nerves, precision, and endurance. It was a contest of patience, where survival hung on silence and shadows. For the British sailors, it was the most dangerous form of courage, standing firm without firing a shot. For the Germans, it was the beginning of entrapment, and for both sides it was a prelude to the storm that was coming. By the evening of May 24th, 1941, Admiral Lutyens faced an intolerable reality. For nearly 24 hours, Bismarck had been shadowed by Suffolk and Norfolk, their radar keeping relentless watch. Every turn, every surge of speed, every attempt at evasion had failed. The oil slick betrayed her course like a scar across the grey Atlantic. The crew grew restless, muttering that the enemy clung like wolves on their trail. Lutyens, normally cautious, recognized that patience was no longer enough. If Bismarck was to reach France, she needed to shake her pursuers. He resolved to take the risk of turning on them. The hunter would briefly become the hunted. At midnight on May 25th, Bismarck suddenly swung her great hull in a sharp turn to starboard. Her wake foamed white as the 50,000-ton Leviathan heeled under the maneuver. Lookouts aboard Suffolk and Norfolk were caught off guard, watching the battleship close the distance at alarming speed. Turrets rotated with mechanical precision, the muzzles of her 15-inch guns looming like a death sentence in the darkness. The British cruisers, utterly outgunned, could not stand and fight. Orders rang out to turn hard away, throttles pushed to maximum as engines strained. Shell splashes erupted around them as Bismarck fired ranging shots into the night. Smoke, spray, and confusion filled the cold air. For a moment it seemed the cruisers would be obliterated, but in the chaos, fate shifted in Bismarck's favor. The sudden charge allowed Bismarck to break radar contact. Suffolk's operators, who had tracked the German battleship for hours, stared at blank screens as the echo vanished. Norfolk too lost her quarry, her beams sweeping uselessly across empty waters. In the darkness and fog, the giant had disappeared. British officers cursed their luck, knowing the entire Royal Navy depended on their reports. For the first time since the Denmark Strait, Bismarck was free of direct pursuit. Lutyens had bought precious hours of concealment with a daring maneuver. Deep in the battleship's operations room, charts were adjusted and new courses set. The order was given full speed for France. Relief swept through the crew, but it was tempered by exhaustion. They knew the enemy would soon resume the hunt. On the British side, the loss of contact caused near panic. Admiral Tovey, aboard King George V, demanded immediate reports, only to be told the cruisers had lost the trail. In the map room in London, Churchill erupted in fury when he learned Bismarck had slipped away. The Prime Minister stalked the war rooms, demanding updates by the minute. "We must find her," he growled. His words carried to every officer in the chain of command. The thought of Bismarck breaking into the Atlantic unchecked was a nightmare. Convoys carrying vital supplies sailed across those waters, their escorts too weak to withstand a battleship. A single sortie could sink hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. Desperation gripped the Admiralty, and new orders flew to every available ship. The chase had entered a new, more dangerous phase. On Bismarck's bridge, the mood was tense but cautiously optimistic. Admiral Lütjens believed his maneuver had been successful and radioed Berlin with news of his breakout. He requested air support from the Luftwaffe once closer to the French coast. Yet the transmission, though necessary, carried its own peril. British signals intelligence intercepted fragments of the message, providing hints of Bismarck's course. Still, for the moment, she steamed unshadowed, her engines pounding against the Atlantic swell. Officers spoke in hushed tones of Brest, where dry docks awaited. The crew, though weary, dared to believe escape was possible. Their thoughts turned to safety, to warm meals, and to the promise of land. But the ocean held dangers unseen. Bismarck was free, but freedom was fragile. The British response was immediate and furious. Admiral Tovey ordered a broad search pattern, sending King George V, Rodney, Victorious, and Ark Royal to sweep the seas. Destroyers fanned out like hounds, combing the ocean with sonar and radar. Aircraft were launched from carriers, their fragile wings straining against the Atlantic gales. Cruisers dashed across the search grid, their lookouts scanning the horizon for smoke. The strain on crews grew unbearable as they searched without rest, driven by Churchill's unyielding command. Fuel consumption soared, and some ships risked running low in the pursuit. But no one dared slacken. The Royal Navy knew its honour, and perhaps Britain's survival was on the line. Each hour without contact deepened the desperation. Each mile widened the uncertainty of where Bismarck might be. For the Germans, the breakout brought temporary relief but not safety. The oil slick still marked their course, a trail that any passing aircraft could discover. Storms battered the ship as she surged south, waves crashing across her deck and soaking exhausted sailors. Lookouts remained at their posts despite fatigue, straining to spot British silhouettes on the horizon. Below decks, engineers nursed the turbines, pushing them to sustain maximum speed despite the damage. The crew endured sleepless nights, sustained by determination and the faint hope of reaching France. Yet whispers spread in the mess decks. Would the British really give up so easily? Some spoke of Hood's loss, fearing the enemy's thirst for revenge would never wane. The men clung to their duty, but unease gnawed at them. They had escaped the hunter's eyes, but not their vengeance. Thus, the breakout attempt marked a turning point in the chase. Bismarck had slipped the leash, but at great risk, and only temporarily, the Royal Navy, humiliated by the loss of contact, expanded its search with unprecedented intensity. In Berlin, propaganda trumpeted the escape as a triumph, but in London the mood was grim determination. Churchill's order, "Sink the Bismarck," now carried an urgency bordering on desperation. For sailors on both sides, the Atlantic had become an arena of uncertainty and dread. The predator had disappeared into the storm, but the hunt was not over. It had merely entered its most dangerous stage. Somewhere on the rolling seas, the wounded giant fled southward, and behind her, an empire's navy surged in pursuit, unwilling to rest until the chase was done. By the evening of May 26, 1941, the Royal Navy's desperation found its answer in the decks of HMS Royal. The carrier, part of Force H, under Admiral James Somerville, steamed north from Gibraltar to intercept Bismarck before she reached the safety of France. On her flight deck waited the fairy Swordfish, relics of another age, their canvas wings and open cockpits a stark contrast to the steel giant they were ordered to attack. Crews joked bitterly about flying string bags, yet they knew their outdated biplanes had one advantage: slow speed made them steady in torpedo runs. In storm-lashed seas, modern fighters might falter, but the Swordfish could cling to the air with stubborn persistence. Pilots and observers strapped themselves in, faces pale beneath their helmets, knowing this mission might be their last. Torpedoes were slung beneath the fragile wings, their warheads armed for a single decisive blow. On the bridge, Somerville gave the order to launch. The attack on Bismarck had begun. The first wave roared into the gale, though roar was an exaggeration for the low hum of the Swordfish engines. Rain lashed the open cockpits, blinding pilots as they fought to keep formation in the turbulent skies. The Atlantic heaved below, waves rising like black mountains that threatened to swallow the tiny aircraft whole. Yet the crews pressed forward, guided by compass bearings and radio directions from Royal. Their mission was brutally simple: find Bismarck, drop torpedoes, and pray. The storm added both danger and opportunity, masking their approach from German lookouts. Spray streaked across goggles, hands froze against controls, but the Swordfish crawled stubbornly through the tempest. They flew low, hugging the sea, their fragile frames rattling with every gust. To observers on Royal's deck, the sight of those antiquated machines vanishing into the storm was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Men whispered that it was a suicide flight. After hours of flight, the Swordfish stumbled upon their quarry, but not the intended one. In a cruel twist, the first torpedo runs were made against HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser shadowing Bismarck. Faulty torpedo detonators caused some warheads to explode prematurely, showering Sheffield with spray, but sparing her from destruction. The mistake, while terrifying, was quickly realized, and new attack orders were issued. Ground crews aboard Royal scrambled to reload torpedoes, this time ensuring magnetic pistols were disabled in favor of contact fuses. The pilots, shaken but undeterred, prepared to launch again into worsening weather. On Sheffield, sailors cursed the near disaster, their nerves frayed by the close call. But the incident proved the Swordfish crew's determination. They would fly again despite the risks. Bismarck still steamed south, and time was running out. The hunters could not afford another error. The second attack wave launched in the fading light of evening, Swordfish engines sputtering against the Atlantic gale. Pilots flew at treetop height over the heaving seas, straining to hold course in the darkness. Ahead, lookouts finally spotted the great shadow of Bismarck cutting through the waves, her massive form unmistakable against the grey horizon. Anti-aircraft guns erupted instantly, tracers crisscrossing the skies in deadly webs of fire. German gunners filled the night with explosions, desperate to swat the fragile biplanes from the air. The Swordfish wove through the barrage, their slow speed oddly saving them, for shells overshot as the planes dipped and bobbed in the storm. Pilots grit their teeth, flying straight into the jaws of death. Observers leaned forward, guiding torpedoes toward their release points with calm precision. Every second felt like an eternity in the firelit sky. Yet the Swordfish pressed on with iron resolve. The first torpedoes splashed into the sea, their wake streaking toward Bismarck's flanks. Sailors aboard the German battleship shouted warnings as the white trails closed in. The ship heeled violently, rudders turning hard as she sought to evade the deadly lines. Some torpedoes missed, detonating harmlessly against the waves. Others struck glancing blows against the armored belt, sending thunderous shocks reverberating through the hull. One hit amidships but failed to penetrate deeply, flooding minor compartments but causing no crippling damage. Still, the attacks rattled the crew, forcing damage control parties into frantic action. For the Swordfish pilots, the sight of explosions against the massive hull proved their courage was not in vain. Yet they knew more would be needed to halt the giant. The battle had become a test of attrition. The Swordfish circled for another pass, their wings peppered with holes, fabric flapping violently in the gale. Bismarck twisted through the sea, her turrets firing skyward in futile defiance. The pilots dropped lower, skimming barely above the waves, risking collision with the ocean itself. Anti-aircraft fire intensified, bursts of flame erupting all around, yet miraculously few planes were hit. The storm, once an enemy, now shielded them, cloaking their fragile frames in rain and darkness. Torpedoes struck again, hammering the battleship, but failing to land a decisive blow. Flames licked across Bismarck's deck, where shells from her own guns ignited fuel from damaged compartments. The Germans fought desperately, firing every weapon they could bring to bear. The Swordfish turned for home, their mission incomplete, but their spirit unbroken. Each man knew he had stared death in the face, and lived to fly another day. As the battered biplanes returned to Ark Royal, crews staggered from their cockpits, soaked, frozen, and shaking with adrenaline. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, patching bullet holes and rearming for another sortie. The pilots reported hits, though not enough to cripple Bismarck outright. Admirals on Ark Royal debated the results, weighing the cost of more attacks against the urgency of stopping the German giant. On the battleship, damage control parties worked tirelessly to contain flooding and fires. Officers reassured the crew that the ship was still seaworthy, still powerful, still capable of reaching France. Yet beneath the optimism lurked unease. The Swordfish had proven they could pierce Bismarck's defenses, and more waves would surely follow. In the cold night, both hunter and hunted braced for the next round. The battle was far from over. Thus the first Ark Royal Swordfish attack became a testament to courage and desperation. The biplanes had flown into storms and fire against impossible odds, striking at the most feared warship in the world. Their damage was limited, but their message was clear. Bismarck was not untouchable. For the Royal Navy, it was proof that persistence might yet bring victory. For the Germans, it was a reminder that even the strongest steel could be tested by frail wings and fragile courage. The ocean that night became a crucible of endurance, where machines of different ages clashed under storm and fire. The Swordfish returned blooded but unbowed, ready to fly again at dawn. And in the Atlantic darkness, the stage was set for a decisive strike. The hunters had tasted hope. The wounded giant still sailed, but her time was running short. The evening of May 26, 1941, brought with it a storm unlike any other in the Atlantic. Overhead, black clouds churned and winds howled, the sea heaving like a living monster. Against this backdrop, Ark Royal's Swordfish biplanes once more clawed into the skies. The crews, exhausted from the earlier mission, knew this flight could decide the fate of the Atlantic War. Armed with contact-fused torpedoes, they launched in squadrons, each fragile machine braving the storm. Pilots gripped controls with frozen hands, struggling to keep their wings level as the gale battered their aircraft. Lightning flickered across the horizon, briefly illuminating the distant shadow of Bismarck. The hunters had found their prey again, but this time the stakes were higher than ever. For tonight, one hit could mean the end. Bismarck's lookouts were the first to spot the approaching Swordfish, their black shapes skimming low across the waves. Alarm bells rang across the battleship as anti-aircraft batteries roared to life. Flames licked the night sky as 37mm and 20mm cannons spat streams of tracers into the storm. The giant swayed heavily in the seas, her gunners struggling to aim against the pitching deck. Every man on board knew the danger. Another torpedo strike could cripple them beyond hope. Below decks, damage control teams braced, sealing watertight compartments in anticipation. Officers shouted orders as the ship twisted violently, rudders heeling to avoid the incoming tracks. The roar of engines, the whistle of wind, and the thunder of guns merged into chaos. In the sky above, Swordfish crews pressed forward. They had only seconds to release. The first torpedoes slammed into the sea, their white trails streaking toward Bismarck's hull. The battleship heeled hard, rudders straining as she tried to twist away. Several detonated against her armored belt, sending thunderous shockwaves reverberating through her frame. The great ship shuddered, steel groaning but still intact. Above, Swordfish pilots circled for another pass, weaving through anti-aircraft fire that clawed desperately at the night. One plane, riddled with holes, pressed dangerously close before releasing at the last moment. Its torpedo skimmed the waves, streaking toward Bismarck's stern. A heartbeat later, an explosion tore through her aft section. Men were thrown from their feet as the ship lurched violently. Below decks, chaos erupted. The strike had jammed Bismarck's rudder, twisting it at a fatal angle. Almost instantly, the ship began to circle, unable to maintain a straight course. Engineers raced to the steering compartments, struggling to free the machinery. Flooded compartments and twisted steel made the task impossible. Sailors sweated in the choking air, forcing levers, straining hydraulics, and hammering at seized gears. Every effort failed. The rudder was locked. On the bridge, Admiral Lütjens received the grim report. Bismarck could still steam at high speed, but she could no longer steer. The ship was doomed to wander in arcs across the Atlantic. The hunters would soon close in. As the realization sank in, despair mingled with grim resolve among the crew. Some men cursed the fragile biplanes that had delivered such a decisive blow. Others muttered that fate itself had turned against them. Captain Lindemann struggled to maintain order, issuing commands to keep engines driving full power. Damage control parties tried desperate improvisations, flooding compartments to counteract the rudder's turn, but every effort only worsened the situation. The sea itself seemed to conspire, rolling the ship into wider circles. Above, the Swordfish dwindled into the storm, their mission complete. For them, survival was victory. For Bismarck, survival was slipping away. On Ark Royal, the returning Swordfish landed one by one, battered by storm and gunfire. Crews staggered from their cockpits, shivering but triumphant. Word spread quickly across the carrier. They had crippled the giant. Admirals Somerville and Tovey received the news with cautious relief. Reports confirmed that Bismarck's rudder was jammed and her maneuverability destroyed. For the first time in the chase, victory seemed within reach. Signals flashed across the Atlantic to every pursuing ship. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were ordered to converge on the crippled Leviathan. Churchill himself was informed at once. The trap was tightening. Aboard Bismarck, Admiral Lütjens gathered his senior officers in the war room. Charts lay spread across the table, but no escape routes remained. He acknowledged that the ship could no longer evade, only fight. Messages were sent to Berlin, assuring the High Command that Bismarck would stand to the last. The crew, though weary and shaken, braced for their final battle. Some men wrote letters home, aware they would never deliver them. Others polished their weapons, determined to sell their lives dearly. The sense of doom spread like smoke through the decks. Yet discipline held, forged by years of naval tradition. Bismarck would not surrender. Thus the fatal blow had been struck. not by a battleship's broadside, but by fragile biplanes flying through storm and fire. The Swordfish, relics of another era, had sealed the fate of the most powerful warship afloat. Bismarck, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was now a wounded giant staggering in the Atlantic, her rudder jammed, her course broken, her destiny set. For the Royal Navy, the moment was vindication, proof that courage and persistence could triumph over steel. For Germany, it was a bitter twist of fate, a humiliation born from frailty. The chase had reached its climax. The hunters were closing in from every horizon, and the endgame of the Bismarck saga had begun. Darkness fell on the Atlantic, and with it came a silence heavy with dread aboard Bismarck. The ship steamed in slow, uneven arcs, her rudder locked at an angle that made escape impossible. The sea groaned against her hull, waves washing across the deck in cold sheets of foam. Inside, corridors flickered with dim lights as exhausted sailors moved quietly through the steel labyrinth. The roar of engines persisted, but even their thunder could not drown the oppressive awareness of doom. Orders were given with grim efficiency, no longer carrying the urgency of survival, but the discipline of preparation. The men knew they would not see land again, and that knowledge lay like lead upon their hearts. Still, watches were kept, duties performed, and damage control parties remained at stations. Pride forbade surrender to despair, even as fate pressed closer. The last night aboard Bismarck had begun. Admiral Lütjens, calm as ever, dictated his final messages to Berlin. His words were steady, declaring that Bismarck would fight until her last shell was fired and her last gun silenced. He did not speak of surrender, nor of desperation, but of duty to the Reich and the Kriegsmarine. In the radio room, operators tapped furiously, sending the message across crackling waves to German high command. Each signal was laced with finality, carrying not hope of relief but certainty of sacrifice. Officers listened in silence, some with clenched jaws, others with haunted eyes. They understood that the Admiral's words were both a declaration and an obituary. Berlin acknowledged the transmissions, promising Luftwaffe support, though all aboard knew none would come in time. The message was not for salvation, it was for history. In those words, Lütjens sealed Bismarck's fate with stoic dignity. Captain Ernst Lindemann walked the decks, his presence a steadying force for the crew. He exchanged brief words with sailors, offering calm reassurances that belied his own private turmoil. Some of the men saluted stiffly, others avoided his gaze, unwilling to reveal their fear. Lindemann's face was pale but resolute, a mask of command that carried the burden of 2,000 souls. He spoke of duty, of honor, of the pride they should take in their ship and her fight. The men clung to his words, though in their hearts they knew death awaited at dawn. In the mess decks, sailors smoked in silence, the usual chatter gone. Some wrote hurried letters they would never send, scraps of farewell destined to sink with the ship. Others prayed quietly, rosaries or small charms clenched tightly in calloused hands. Discipline kept them working, but fear gnawed beneath the surface. Below decks, the engineers labored endlessly in the suffocating heat of the machinery spaces. Sweat poured from their bodies as they coaxed the turbines to maintain speed, though they knew the effort was futile. The rudder remained jammed, defying every attempt to free it, despite hours of relentless struggle. Mechanics hammered at twisted steel, sparks flying in the stifling air. Others rigged makeshift lines, flooding compartments to counterbalance the turn, but nothing changed Bismarck's doomed course. The engines roared on, a futile heartbeat in a body already mortally wounded. The men worked not because they believed it would save them, but because their duty demanded it. They would not abandon their posts, even as the inevitability of failure bore down upon them. In their stubborn perseverance lay a grim kind of heroism. The ship lived through their sweat, if only for a few more hours. On the open decks, the night air was bitterly cold, the spray biting against weary faces. Lookouts manned their stations, peering into the darkness for silhouettes that needed no imagination to appear. Destroyers of the Royal Navy had already been spotted at distance, their shadows closing in under cover of night. The sailors knew they were being encircled, penned in like a wounded beast. Anti-aircraft crews remained at the ready, though the skies above were quiet now. Conversations drifted between fatalistic resignation and defiant bravado, each man coping in his own way. Some vowed to take as many enemies as possible with them when the battle came. Others simply stared into the horizon, lost in thoughts of home and family. The salt wind stung their eyes, but no tears were shed openly. Pride still held its grip on the decks of the dying giant. Among the younger sailors, the mood was more fragile, a mixture of dread and disbelief. Many had never seen combat before the Denmark Strait, and now their first voyage was to be their last. Some huddled together in corners, whispering fears too heavy to bear alone. Veterans of the crew tried to steady them, sharing cigarettes, telling fragments of stories from better days. Chaplains moved quietly through the ship, offering words of comfort to those who asked. The corridors echoed with the quiet rhythm of boots and the faint hum of machinery. Fear was present in every glance, every tremor of hands holding tools or weapons. Yet no one abandoned their station, for discipline bound them tighter than fear. In the steel bowels of Bismarck, resolve hardened even as hope faded. The crew awaited dawn, like men waiting for judgment. Admiral Lutyens withdrew to his cabin briefly, composing himself in solitude before returning to duty. Reports from the bridge confirmed what he already knew. Bismarck was trapped and her hunters drew ever nearer. He studied charts marked with converging lines, a net closing from all directions. Messages from Berlin promised help, but he no longer believed them. His thoughts turned to his men, to the thousands who would face death with him. He resolved that their sacrifice must not be forgotten, even if it served only as a symbol of defiance. When he returned to the bridge, his face revealed nothing but calm determination. His presence steadied officers and crew alike, a silent command to stand firm. The admiral's resolve became their own. In that silence, the spirit of Bismarck remained unbroken. So passed the last night of Germany's greatest warship, a night heavy with foreboding and courage. The sea outside rolled endlessly, a dark expanse that concealed the hunters drawing closer. Inside, men clung to duty, to faith, or to fragments of hope that had already slipped away. Conversations dwindled as exhaustion and fatalism weighed upon every deck. The engines roared, the ship moved, but her fate was sealed. Letters lay unfinished, prayers whispered, cigarettes burned to ash. Discipline held firm, but resignation seeped into every shadow. Above it all, the admiral's final messages echoed, affirming that Bismarck would never yield. The crew awaited dawn, not with expectation, but with grim acceptance. The last night was not of hope, but of resolve. Dawn broke on May 27, 1941, revealing a grey Atlantic Sea heavy with mist and wind. Out of that mist emerged two massive silhouettes, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, the pride of the Royal Navy. Their crews had been preparing all night, gun crews at their stations, powder and shells loaded in magazines, and rangefinders locked onto their target. Ahead lay the crippled Bismarck, still steaming but unable to steer, trapped in endless circles. On her decks, sailors braced for the inevitable, each man aware the hour of reckoning had come. At 8:47, The British battleships opened fire with thunderous broadsides. Massive shells arced across the sky, descending toward the German giant with terrifying speed. The sea erupted in towering plumes as the first salvos bracketed their target. The long-awaited clash of titans had begun. The final battle for Bismarck was underway. Rodney fired first, unleashing her 9 16-inch guns with devastating force. The shockwaves rolled across her deck, shaking men to their core as the shells tore into the morning sky. King George V joined seconds later, her 10 14-inch guns adding to the crescendo of thunder. The two battleships pounded Bismarck from ranges as close as 3 nautical miles, point blank for weapons of such size. On Bismarck, the first shells struck with terrifying violence, ripping open steel, hurling debris, and setting fires across the decks. Men were thrown to the ground, ears ringing from the concussions that tore through the ship. Gun turrets groaned as they tried to reply, but their aim was erratic, hampered by the jammed rudder and unsteady course. Still, the crew fought valiantly, their 15-inch guns belching fire into the storm of incoming shells. The duel was savage and merciless, steel against steel in the Atlantic dawn. Bismarck's ordeal had truly begun. The German gunners fought with determination, their salvos straddling the British battleships. Plumes of water shot skyward as shells splashed dangerously close to King George V. One near miss shook Rodney, showering her decks with spray and fragments of steel. Yet the British held their course, hammering away with relentless precision. Shell after shell slammed into Bismarck, tearing through superstructure, smashing fire control towers, and silencing gun batteries. Her bridge was shattered, her communications cut, her decks littered with wreckage and fire. Still, her turrets fought back, their crews loading shells with hands blistered and bloodied. The thunder of combat rolled across the Atlantic, a symphony of destruction unmatched in the naval war. The sea itself seemed to tremble under the barrage. Each minute brought Bismarck closer to annihilation. As the minute stretched into half an hour, the scale of destruction grew unbearable. Rodney's massive shells tore into Bismarck's bow, ripping open compartments and flooding them with seawater. King George V's fire smashed the superstructure, collapsing rangefinders and scattering officers. Smoke poured from fires raging across the decks, black plumes twisting into the storm-grey sky. The once proud battleship was being reduced to ruin before the eyes of her crew. Yet still, pockets of resistance remained, gun crews fighting with desperate determination. Anti-aircraft batteries, useless against planes in this battle, turned their fire skyward in futility, while others tried to engage destroyers circling closer. The decks were a scene of chaos, flames and shattered steel mingling with the cries of the wounded. German sailors fought not for victory, but for honor. Each shell that left a German gun was an act of defiance. Each moment of survival was a final gesture of pride. By mid-morning, Bismarck was a wreck, yet still afloat, refusing to die. Her main guns fired sporadically, some turrets jammed, others destroyed by direct hits. One by one, her weapons fell silent, as British shells smashed them into twisted metal. Rodney closed even further, firing from ranges so close that her guns depressed nearly flat. The blast tore through Bismarck's hull, ripping massive holes and blasting men overboard. Survivors below decks described compartments filled with smoke, fire, and choking fumes. Flooding spread through the ship, forcing men to abandon their stations. Still, some clung to their posts, loading shells, manning pumps, refusing to give in. Above decks, the once formidable superstructure was little more than a burning skeleton. Yet still the flag of the Kriegsmarine flew defiantly from her mast. Destroyers now joined the assault, darting closer to launch torpedoes against the crippled Leviathan. Their sleek hulls cut across the waves, releasing deadly wakes that streaked toward the German battleship. Explosions tore through her flanks, each detonation sending tremors through her frame. Fires spread unchecked, black smoke billowing skyward like a funeral pyre. The sea around her churned with wreckage, lifeboats destroyed before they could be launched. On Rodney and King George V, sailors cheered grimly at each hit, though few felt joy in the destruction. It was vengeance for Hood, but also the grim execution of a trapped enemy. The thunder of guns echoed across the waters, relentless and pitiless. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still Bismarck endured. Her survival became less triumph than torment. By 10 a.m., the outcome was no longer in doubt. Bismarck's guns were silent, her crew decimated, her decks awash in blood and flame. The battleship, once the pride of Germany, was now little more than a burning, drifting hulk. Admiral Tovey, watching from King George V, finally ordered his battleships to cease fire. They had fired thousands of shells, expending enormous arsenals to pound Bismarck into submission. Yet the German warship refused to sink, her hull stubbornly holding against the sea. It fell to torpedoes, launched at close range, to finish the job. British destroyers circled like wolves, delivering the final blows. Deep below decks, scuttling charges were prepared by German engineers. The end was near, not by choice of the hunters alone, but by the hands of those trapped aboard. Thus ended the final battle of Bismarck, a clash of steel and fire unmatched in naval history. In less than 2 hours, the mightiest warship of the Kriegsmarine had been reduced to ruin. The pride of Germany lay broken, her crew scattered between flame, steel, and the cold Atlantic waves. For the Royal Navy, it was both triumph and tragedy, victory over a dreaded foe, but at the cost of witnessing such destruction. For the sailors of Bismarck, it was a last stand carried out with unflinching resolve. Their ship died not quietly, but in thunder, fire, and dignity. The Atlantic swallowed the burning wreck, leaving only oil wreckage and men clinging to life in the freezing sea. The hunters had done their duty, and vengeance for Hood was complete. Yet as silence fell across the ocean, there was little joy. Only the echoes of guns remained, fading into history. As the guns of King George V and Rodney finally fell silent, an eerie quiet spread across the Atlantic battlefield. Smoke rose in black columns from the shattered hulk of Bismarck, her decks broken and aflame. The order spread among the surviving German officers: abandon ship. Chaos erupted instantly as sailors scrambled across buckled steel in search of lifeboats and rafts. Many lifeboats had already been destroyed by shellfire, leaving men with no choice but to leap into the frigid sea. Flames roared around ammunition stores, and explosions ripped through twisted bulkheads. Shrapnel and debris littered the decks, complicating every movement. Sailors stumbled through smoke, coughing and blinded, as fire and water consumed their ship together. In that moment, discipline gave way to raw survival. The pride of the Kriegsmarine was dying, and her crew was desperate to escape. On the upper decks, scenes of desperation unfolded with harrowing clarity. Sailors tore at davits to free the few surviving boats, while others shoved makeshift rafts into the waves. Many clung to planks of wood or overturned wreckage, anything that might keep them afloat. The sea, black with oil and debris, churned with waves that battered the desperate men. Some jumped fully clothed, only to be dragged under by the weight of their uniforms and boots. Others stripped down to their undergarments, plunging into the icy water with screams that were lost to the wind. Bodies floated amid the wreckage, motionless, as comrades swam frantically past them. Amid the horror, some still shouted prayers, while others cursed the fate that had brought them here. Smoke filled the air, stinging eyes and throats, making every breath agony. Survival was no longer a matter of duty, but of instinct. Below decks, chaos was worse still. As corridors filled with fire, smoke, and seawater, trapped sailors clawed at hatches and bulkheads, their shouts drowned by the roar of explosions. Some managed to escape through ladders and ladders, bursting into daylight with faces blackened by soot. Others were cut off, sealed within compartments already flooding beyond hope. Engineers who had fought so long to keep the turbines running were among the last to leave, abandoning their beloved machinery. The heat was unbearable, steam hissing from ruptured pipes, decks collapsing under their feet. Many who tried to reach the topside were overcome by smoke, collapsing before they could climb out. Those who reached the decks found little salvation, only fire and the endless sea. It was a ship consumed from within as well as without. For many, escape was simply impossible. In the sea around Bismarck, hundreds of men fought for survival. The water was frigid, numbing limbs within minutes, sapping strength from even the strongest swimmers. Oil spread across the surface, burning throats and stinging eyes as men gasped for air. Wreckage floated everywhere, from shattered beams to pieces of lifeboats, serving as fragile rafts for the desperate. Shouts filled the air, cries for help, and screams of agony carried across the waves. British destroyers circled cautiously, their crews watching the human tragedy unfold before them. Orders soon came to launch rescue efforts, despite the risk of lurking U-boats beneath the surface. Ropes and nets were thrown overboard, sailors leaning out to haul survivors onto the decks. Some Germans resisted at first, fearing capture, but exhaustion quickly overcame hesitation. For those still afloat, salvation came not from their own navy, but from their enemy. HMS Dorsetshire moved in, her crew throwing lines to the struggling survivors. Men clung desperately, their frozen fingers barely gripping as they were pulled aboard. British sailors worked tirelessly, dragging oil-soaked men from the sea, their faces pale and haunted by the suffering before them. On Dorsetshires deck, medics treated hypothermia, burns, and shattered limbs. German survivors, dazed and shivering, collapsed in exhaustion, some weeping openly. Sailors who had moments earlier been enemies now shared blankets, cigarettes, and water. There was no hatred in those moments, only the recognition of shared humanity in the face of death. Yet time was short, for reports of U-boat activity grew louder with every passing minute. British commanders knew their rescue efforts could not last forever. The sea still held dangers far beyond the wreckage. As more men were hauled aboard, a sudden alarm rippled across Dorsetshire's bridge. Hydrophone operators reported contacts, possible submarines closing on the area. Fear of a counterattack forced the British to make a grim decision. Rescue operations were cut short, and orders came to withdraw before U-boats could strike. Lines were hastily pulled back, and engines roared as Dorsetshire began to retreat from the deadly waters. Hundreds of German sailors still floated in the sea, waving, shouting, begging for salvation, but the destroyers turned away, leaving them to the Atlantic's cold embrace. For the men left behind, despair was absolute, their cries fading as distance grew. It was the cruel arithmetic of war. Survival of the rescuers meant abandonment of the drowning. Duty demanded retreat, no matter the human cost. In the end, only about 110 survivors were rescued from a crew of over 2,200. The rest perished in the cold waters, swallowed by fire, steel, and sea. Some drowned quickly, dragged under by exhaustion or the weight of oil-soaked clothes. Others floated for hours before succumbing to hypothermia or waves. The survivors huddled on Dorsetshire's deck, stunned by the scale of the loss. Their faces bore the hollow stare of men who had looked into the abyss and survived by chance alone. For the British sailors, the haunting cries of the abandoned lingered long after the engines carried them away. Many never forgot the sound of desperate voices fading into silence. It was a moment of victory overshadowed by tragedy. The Atlantic had claimed the rest. Thus ended the story of Bismarck, not with her guns firing, but with her crew scattered across the waves. The ship that had once symbolized German naval might now lay broken beneath the ocean. Her survivors carried the memory of fire, steel, and death into captivity, haunted by what they had witnessed. For the Royal Navy, triumph was tempered by the tragedy of so many lost lives. For history, the image of men abandoned in the Atlantic became one of the most haunting episodes of the naval war. The final hours of Bismarck were not only about victory and defeat, but about the human cost of total war. The Atlantic itself became a grave for thousands, marked only by oil and wreckage. Above, the storm clouds rolled on, indifferent to the suffering below. The hunters had prevailed, but at a price written in human lives. The saga of Bismarck closed in tragedy as much as triumph. When the guns fell silent and the wreckage settled, the sea itself became both graveyard and witness. Out of more than 2,200 men aboard Bismarck, only 114 survivors remained alive. The numbers alone told the story of unimaginable loss, a ship's company almost entirely erased in one battle. For hours after the sinking, the Atlantic rolled cold and indifferent, carrying away cries until only silence remained. Oil slicks stretched across the surface, shimmering black in the dawn light. Lifeless bodies floated among shattered timbers, steel fragments, and lifeboat wreckage. Sharks were rumored in the waters, though hypothermia claimed most long before predators arrived. The British ships that had withdrawn carried with them both triumph and guilt. For those left behind, the ocean itself was executioner. The pride of Germany had vanished beneath the waves, taking her men with her. On board HMS Dorsetshire, the rescued Germans lay huddled in blankets, their faces pale with shock. Many were covered in burns, cuts, or oil, their bodies trembling with cold despite the aid given. Medics worked tirelessly, forcing hot tea into frozen hands, wrapping wounds in makeshift bandages. Some survivors could not stop shaking, while others sat staring blankly into space, their eyes hollow. A few wept openly, overwhelmed by the memory of comrades who had vanished in the sea. Others muttered prayers under their breath, whispering names of families they thought they would never see again. British sailors, hardened by war, could not help but feel pity for the defeated men. Cigarettes were shared, hands offered, words of comfort exchanged in broken English and German. In those moments, the boundary between enemy and rescuer blurred. They were simply sailors, united by survival in a merciless ocean. The emotional toll was equally heavy on the British crews who had taken part in the battle. Many felt grim satisfaction that Hood had been avenged, yet that satisfaction was tempered by what they had witnessed. The cries of the drowning echoed in their minds long after the engines carried them away. Some sailors confessed that the sight of men abandoned in the water would haunt them for life. Officers wrestled with the cruel necessity of withdrawing in fear of U-boats. They knew that hundreds more could have been saved had there been no submarine threat. Yet they also knew that lingering would have risked their own ships, perhaps repeating the tragedy they had just delivered to the Germans. The line between duty and humanity had never felt so cruelly thin. In victory they carried a burden of sorrow. Triumph and tragedy were inseparable in the Atlantic that day. For the German survivors, captivity began with trauma that could not be erased. Many had lost brothers, friends, and shipmates in the inferno of Bismarck's destruction. Some recounted the moment of explosion, of fire sweeping through compartments, of comrades cut down before their eyes. Others remembered the silence that followed the order to abandon ship, a silence broken only by the roar of flames and the crash of waves. Each survivor carried his own fragment of the nightmare, a piece of memory that would never fade. The sea had spared them, but in sparing them it had cursed them with remembrance. Their testimonies later revealed the scale of suffering endured in those final hours. In captivity, they were treated with professionalism, but no kindness could erase what had happened. For them the war would always be defined by one word: Bismarck. In Britain, the news of Bismarck's destruction spread like wildfire. Newspapers carried bold headlines: "Bismarck sunk" and "Vengeance for Hood." The public, reeling from months of losses at sea, finally felt a surge of relief. Churchill's command, "Sink the Bismarck," had been fulfilled, and the Royal Navy's honour restored. Yet behind the triumph lay a sobering awareness of the cost of victory. The sheer scale of German casualties tempered celebration with reflection. Admirals praised the bravery of the Swordfish crews, the dogged shadowing by cruisers, and the relentless pursuit by the fleet. Still, even in victory, the images of drowning men and abandoned sailors lingered. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just about ships and steel, but about lives consumed by the ocean. For every headline, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of tragedy. In Germany, the loss of Bismarck was a crushing blow to both morale and naval prestige. The pride of the Kriegsmarine had been destroyed on her first and only mission. Propaganda sought to spin the story as a noble sacrifice, emphasizing the courage of the crew and their refusal to surrender. But beneath the rhetoric lay humiliation. A ship that had taken years to build was gone in less than 2 weeks at sea. Families received telegrams, terse notices of death, their grief multiplied by the scale of loss. In naval circles, debates raged about the decisions of Admiral Lütjens and the vulnerability exposed by the Swordfish attack. The loss left Germany's surface fleet crippled, forcing greater reliance on U-boats for the remainder of the war. The memory of Bismarck became both a legend and a warning. She was remembered not for victories, but for her tragic end. For historians, the sinking of Bismarck became a study in contrast: technological might undone by fragile biplanes, tactical brilliance overshadowed by fate. The numbers told one story, but the human experience told another, equally compelling. Survivors spoke of camaraderie and terror, of pride and despair intermingling in the ship's final hours. British sailors spoke of vengeance achieved, but also of nightmares they could not shake. The sea itself emerged as the most powerful actor, indifferent to both courage and suffering. It preserved some lives even as it extinguished so many others. Bismarck's destruction showed that war at sea was never only about strategy and weapons. It was about endurance, humanity, and the thin line between survival and oblivion. The Atlantic gave no mercy, only memory, and in that memory, the name Bismarck lived on. Thus the aftermath of the sinking was more than the end of a ship. It was the embodiment of war's contradictions. Triumph for one side was tragedy for the other, and both carried scars that would last a lifetime. The survivors bore witness to fire, steel, and death, their lives forever bound to the Atlantic. The rescuers carried memories of voices they could not save, haunted by duty's cruel demands. Families in Britain and Germany alike mourned sons who would never return. The sinking reshaped the naval war, but also human hearts, leaving lessons that transcended strategy. Bismarck's story was no longer just about naval power. It was about sacrifice and loss. The Atlantic claimed her as it had claimed so many before, and in the silence that followed, the echoes of tragedy lingered. The sea had spoken, and it spoke with finality. News of Bismarck's destruction reached Berlin in a shroud of silence. broken only by the urgency of the propaganda ministry. Goebbels and his staff understood that such a defeat could shatter confidence in the Kriegsmarine and the wider war effort. Carefully worded communiques framed the battle not as a disaster, but as an act of heroism. The official narrative spoke of a gallant last stand against overwhelming odds, portraying the crew as martyrs of the Reich. Radio broadcasts glorified Admiral Lütjens, describing him as a commander who had embraced certain death with stoic resolve. Every mention of the ship emphasized courage, sacrifice, and loyalty to the Führer. Yet beneath the surface, the High Command felt the sting of humiliation. Years of resources and secrecy had gone into building Bismarck, only for her to perish on her first mission. Naval officers whispered about flaws in planning, strategy, and doctrine. No propaganda could erase the bitter truth behind the loss. Families across Germany received the dreaded telegrams, terse notices that confirmed their sons, brothers, or husbands were gone. The scale of loss, more than 2,000 men, was staggering, touching communities in every corner of the Reich. Mothers wept in silence, fathers clenched fists, and wives struggled to explain the absence to bewildered children. In small towns and cities alike, black banners of mourning appeared in windows. The Kriegsmarine tried to emphasize pride and sacrifice, encouraging families to see their loss as part of a national struggle. Yet grief could not be easily molded into political messaging. Letters smuggled from survivors spoke of horror, chaos, and abandonment, painting a starkly different picture. Disillusionment seeped quietly into German society, even if few dared to voice it openly. For many, Bismarck's demise symbolized the futility of fighting a world already aligned against Germany. It was a national wound hidden behind the curtain of propaganda. In Britain, the reaction was the opposite, a tidal wave of relief and celebration. Newspapers ran bold headlines, "Bismarck sunk," splashed across front pages with triumphant detail. For a public long battered by blitz raids, U-boat sinkings, and the loss of HMS Hood, the news lifted spirits. People crowded around radios, cheering as announcers recounted the destruction of Hitler's most powerful battleship. The sense of vengeance for Hood's 1,400 dead sailors was palpable across the nation. Yet it was more than revenge. It was proof that the Royal Navy still commanded the seas. For weeks, morale had been shaken by fears of German surface raiders threatening lifelines of food and supplies. The end of Bismarck meant renewed confidence in Britain's ability to endure. In pubs, factories, and bomb shelters, ordinary people spoke of the victory with pride. For them, it was a rare triumph in a war that had offered few easy victories. Churchill himself reflected deeply on the meaning of Bismarck's destruction. He had issued the simple, urgent order, "Sink the Bismarck," but knew the weight of such a command. In his war memoirs, he later described the tension of those days as among the greatest of his premiership. The loss of Hood had wounded him personally, reminding him of Britain's vulnerability. When the telegram arrived confirming Bismarck's sinking, he felt both elation and sober relief. He knew the Royal Navy had preserved its honor and reassured the nation. Yet he also recognized that the victory was not cheap. Thousands of men, many young and untested, had perished in the sea. To him, Bismarck's sinking was not just a battle won, but a message to allies and enemies alike. Britain was bruised but unbroken, capable of striking back even in its darkest hours. In his speeches, he framed it as proof of Britain's unyielding resolve. Inside the Admiralty, officers pored over reports of the battle with satisfaction and caution. They recognized the victory as essential, but also saw the vulnerabilities it revealed. The Royal Navy had nearly lost contact with Bismarck several times, saved only by persistence and radar. The attack by Swordfish biplanes, miraculous in its success, underscored both ingenuity and desperation. Admirals debated whether reliance on fragile aircraft for decisive strikes could be sustained in future battles. The cost of deploying so many ships and crews to hunt one battleship was also carefully noted. Yet for now, victory overshadowed such concerns, and the Admiralty celebrated its sailors. Medals and commendations were prepared for aviators, destroyer captains, and battleship gunners alike. The Navy's reputation, shaken after Hood's loss, was restored. Bismarck had become both a warning and a vindication. In Berlin, Hitler received the news with fury masked by stoicism. He had invested personal pride in Bismarck, seeing her as proof of German power on the seas. Her destruction wounded him, not only strategically, but symbolically, undermining his vision of naval supremacy. At meetings, he railed against the failure of admirals and cursed the weakness of the surface fleet. From that point forward, his faith shifted almost entirely to the U-boat arm, which he believed could still strangle Britain. The grand dreams of building more battleships, outlined in the Plan Z naval expansion, quietly faded. For surviving officers of the Kriegsmarine, the loss was a humiliation they would never forget. The shadow of Bismarck loomed over every naval decision made afterward. It was a moment when illusion met reality. The Reich's dreams of a blue water navy died with her. In London, Parliament erupted with applause when Churchill confirmed the victory. Members cheered not only the navy, but the spirit of the nation that had endured so much. The destruction of Bismarck was hailed as one of the great moments of the war, a morale boost equal to the Battle of Britain. Editorials praised the courage of the aviators who flew into storms in antiquated biplanes. They praised the sailors who chased Bismarck relentlessly, refusing to rest until the job was done. Yet they also acknowledged the price, the thousands of German sailors who had drowned in the Atlantic. Some voices, quieter but insistent, called for compassion even toward the enemy dead. Others insisted the tragedy was the inevitable result of Hitler's aggression. The debate mirrored the duality of victory. Triumph mingled with pity. War had once again revealed its human cost. Thus, the reactions in Berlin and London were mirror images, each shaped by politics, pride, and pain. For Germany, it was a loss cloaked in rhetoric, yet deeply felt in grief and humiliation. For Britain, it was a victory celebrated with cheers, but haunted by memories of Hood and the sight of men left in the sea. Both nations recognized that Bismarck's sinking marked more than a tactical event. It was a turning point in naval warfare. It affirmed Britain's supremacy on the oceans, while forcing Germany into a submarine war it could not escape. It revealed the fragility of ships once thought invincible and the unpredictable nature of modern battle. In speeches, newspapers, and private letters, the event was etched into collective memory. Bismarck had sailed as a symbol of power and perished as a symbol of futility. Her loss echoed far beyond the Atlantic. In Berlin and London alike, she became legend. The destruction of Bismarck was more than the loss of a battleship. It was the end of an era in naval warfare. Her sinking revealed that no vessel, no matter how formidable, could operate alone against a determined enemy fleet. The illusion of invincibility, nurtured by her imposing size and heavy guns, was shattered in the Atlantic swell. The battle exposed the limits of surface raiders in a world increasingly dominated by air power and radar. For the Kriegsmarine, the lesson was clear. Prestige ships could not win wars, but submarines might. For the Royal Navy, it was a reaffirmation of sea power, tempered by the awareness of their own vulnerabilities. The Swordfish torpedo planes had succeeded where heavy guns struggled, proving that aircraft had become decisive. In that realization lay the seeds of a new naval doctrine. The legacy of Bismarck was not triumph alone, but transformation. Within Germany, the loss of Bismarck forced a painful re-evaluation of naval priorities. Admiral Raeder had long envisioned a balanced fleet, complete with battleships to challenge Britain's supremacy, yet the destruction of his flagship exposed the futility of that vision against the Royal Navy's sheer scale and coordination. Hitler's anger after the sinking marked a shift in naval strategy, away from surface vessels and toward the U-boat arm. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the submarine force, seized the moment to argue his case. He insisted that U-boats, not battleships, offered the only realistic chance to strangle Britain. From that point onward, resources flowed increasingly toward submarine production at the expense of capital ship construction. The shift changed the face of the Atlantic War, intensifying the U-boat campaign. Bismarck's death thus reshaped the future of German naval warfare. Her end was the birth of a submarine empire. For Britain, Bismarck's sinking became a symbol of resilience in a time of hardship. The Royal Navy had proven that even its oldest ships and slowest aircraft could prevail with courage and ingenuity. The chase across the Atlantic showed the world that Britain's maritime spirit remained unbroken. At a moment when invasion fears still lingered, this victory reassured the public and allies alike. Churchill called it a triumph of persistence, crediting the relentless spirit of the fleet. The propaganda value was immense, bolstering morale at home and confidence abroad. In the United States, still officially neutral, newspapers marveled at Britain's determination. The hunt for Bismarck became a story of David and Goliath, with Britain cast as the underdog slayer of a giant. The symbolism resonated far beyond the Atlantic. Bismarck's name became shorthand for German hubris undone by Allied resolve. Naval strategists studied the battle intensely, analyzing every detail of the pursuit and destruction. One lesson was the importance of coordination between air and sea forces, which had been decisive in crippling Bismarck's rudder. Another was the vulnerability of surface raiders, which could be shadowed by radar-equipped cruisers and hunted relentlessly. The Royal Navy also recognized the critical role of intelligence in shaping the chase. Without intercepts and sightings, Bismarck might have slipped into the safety of occupied France. For Germany, the analysis was harsher, highlighting poor planning, inflexible command decisions, and the dangers of operating without air cover. Even the mighty Yamato-class battleships of Japan would later face similar vulnerabilities, showing the universal nature of these lessons. The age of the battleship, as the ultimate arbiter of naval war, was drawing to a close. Bismarck's story confirmed that the future belonged to carriers, submarines, and aircraft. Her legacy was a warning etched in steel and fire. In Germany's naval circles, Bismarck's loss was remembered with a mix of pride and bitterness. Veterans spoke of her as a glorious but doomed experiment, a marvel of engineering trapped in the wrong war. Her crew had fought with valor, yet their sacrifice had been squandered by flawed strategy. Naval officers debated whether Luchen should have withdrawn sooner or risked a different course. Others argued that the ship's very existence had been folly in a conflict dominated by air power and submarines. For survivors, the memory was deeply personal, defined by comrades lost in fire and sea. For the public, she became a mythic figure, her name spoken with reverence even in defeat. Songs and stories elevated her to a symbol of sacrifice, echoing through the war years. Yet behind the myth lay a harsh reality: she had achieved little before her destruction. The pride of the Reich had become its most famous failure. In Britain, the victory was enshrined in history and culture. The order to sink the Bismarck became one of the most famous commands of the war. The chase was retold in books, films, and songs, immortalizing the drama on the high seas. Veterans who had participated in the pursuit carried the memory with pride, their stories passed down through generations. The battle became a case study at naval academies, illustrating both daring and discipline. For ordinary citizens, it was a tale of hope at a time of darkness. The sense of national vindication after Hood's loss could not be overstated. Britain's naval prestige, so long a source of pride, had been reaffirmed in spectacular fashion. Yet even here, there was recognition of the immense human cost borne by German sailors. The legacy of Bismarck was celebrated, but never without somber reflection. As the war progressed, the lessons of Bismarck echoed in every major naval campaign. At Midway, aircraft carriers proved that planes, not battleships, now ruled the seas. In the Mediterranean, Malta convoys and Italian fleet actions showed the growing dominance of air reconnaissance and strike power. In the Atlantic, U-boat warfare reached its deadly peak, fulfilling the shift in German strategy after Bismarck's loss. Allied escort carriers, radar, and long-range patrol planes eventually turned the tide, but the struggle was shaped by that earlier decision. Naval architecture also shifted, with fewer resources spent on massive gunships and more invested in versatile carriers and escorts. Bismarck's destruction had accelerated a transformation already underway. Her sinking was not an isolated event, but part of a wider narrative of change. She was both the last of her kind and the herald of a new age. Her legacy was written in the design of every ship that followed. In the end, the legacy of Bismarck was a paradox of glory and futility. She embodied German engineering brilliance, yet also the hubris of building a weapon ill-suited for modern war. Her sinking marked the twilight of the battleship era, a dramatic full stop in naval history. For Britain, she was proof of endurance; for Germany, a symbol of loss; and for the world, a lesson in change. Her story became legend, told and retold in countless accounts, always tinged with tragedy. Beneath the waves of the Atlantic, her wreck still lies, a monument to the men who served and died aboard. Divers and historians have returned to her, uncovering scars that match the stories told by survivors. Each rusted plate and twisted gun still whispers of her last battle. Bismarck's name endures, not for the victories she won, but for the lessons she taught. Her legacy is steel, fire, memory, and the inevitability of change. Nearly half a century after Bismarck sank beneath the Atlantic waves, her story still haunted historians, veterans, and the public alike. For decades, the wreck's exact location remained a mystery, hidden beneath nearly 3 miles of water. Survivors spoke of her final plunge, but no one could confirm what had become of the mighty battleship in her grave. Then, in 1989, famed oceanographer Robert Ballard, who had discovered the Titanic only 4 years earlier, turned his attention to Bismarck. Armed with deep-sea submersibles and advanced sonar, his team set out into the North Atlantic. Their goal was not merely to locate her, but to study her final resting place in forensic detail. The expedition captured global attention, reigniting fascination with one of World II's most legendary warships. Every sonar ping, every sweep of the ocean floor carried with it anticipation. The search was both scientific mission and historical pilgrimage. After days of painstaking exploration, the outlines of a massive structure emerged from the darkness of the seabed. Cameras revealed the unmistakable form of Bismarck, lying upright in astonishing preservation. At once she appeared both proud and broken, a ghost of steel entombed in the silence of the deep. Her hull was largely intact, her bow and stern still joined, but her superstructure lay in ruins from the furious bombardment. The armor belt, once her greatest strength, was visible even in death, a testament to her formidable design. Around her lay debris, twisted metal, scattered weapons, and remnants of her shattered masts. The ocean had claimed her but preserved her in a strange dignity. Ballard's team marveled at the size, calling her a sleeping giant resting in eternal silence. For the first time since 1941, human eyes had seen Bismarck again. The legend had risen from the depths. Close inspection revealed the scars of battle etched into her steel. Great gashes from 14-inch and 16-inch shells marked her sides, each hole telling a story of destruction. Turrets lay blown apart, their barrels twisted like broken bones from the relentless shelling. The rudder, fatally jammed by a torpedo, was visible in its damaged state, confirming the blow that doomed her. Fires had gutted compartments, leaving blackened steel that still bore the marks of inferno. The deck was littered with collapsed structures, remnants of bridge towers, and shattered rangefinders. Yet, despite the devastation, Bismarck's overall form remained remarkably whole, resisting complete collapse. Her construction had been so robust that even decades underwater could not erase her shape. She was both ruin and monument, a paradox of strength and vulnerability. The wreck testified to both human ingenuity and human folly. Ballard made a controversial choice in documenting the wreck. He declared it a war grave. More than 2,000 men had died aboard Bismarck, and the seabed was their final resting place. To disturb it with salvage operations or intrusive exploration would be an act of desecration. His team filmed and photographed, but left the ship untouched, preserving the dignity of the fallen. Survivors of the battle, now elderly, expressed gratitude that their comrade's grave would not be violated. For them, the rediscovery was not about glory, but about remembrance. Each image stirred memories of fire, chaos, and comrades lost to the sea. Families of the dead saw the wreck as confirmation of sacrifice, a silent tomb sealed forever. The Atlantic had claimed Bismarck, and Ballard had ensured she remained undisturbed. The wreck was no longer myth, but sacred reality. The rediscovery sparked debate among historians and naval experts about Bismarck's end. Some argued that she had been sunk primarily by British torpedoes, while others insisted the Germans scuttled her to deny capture. Ballard's images suggested a combination. Massive shell fire had crippled her, but scuttling charges hastened her final plunge. The discovery rekindled interest in her story, prompting new books, documentaries, and studies. Every detail of her construction and destruction was re-examined through the lens of the wreck. The scars of battle became evidence in a debate that had lasted nearly 5 decades. Beyond the technical questions, the wreck symbolized the futility of warships in the age of aircraft. Her grandeur beneath the sea reminded the world that power had its limits. In the silence of the deep, Bismarck told her story without words. She remained both legend and lesson. For Germany, the rediscovery reopened a wound, but also provided closure. The ship that had once been a symbol of pride now lay as a relic of tragedy. Younger generations saw her not as propaganda, but as history, evidence of a war that had scarred their nation. Veterans who visited Ballard's footage wept quietly, recognizing the steel tomb as both curse and sanctuary. In naval circles, Bismarck became a study in overreach, a caution against prestige projects that served more for image than strategy. For historians, the wreck illustrated the turning point from battleships to aircraft carriers and submarines. For ordinary Germans, it was a reminder of sacrifice without gain, a story of bravery wasted by flawed leadership. Her name lived on, but stripped of propaganda, it carried the weight of loss. In Rediscovery, Bismarck became less a weapon and more a memorial. She was the sea's most enduring epitaph. In Britain, the Rediscovery rekindled old memories of triumph and tragedy. Veterans of the Hood and the Bismarck chase spoke again, their voices trembling with age but sharp with memory. The wreck served as both validation and reminder, proof of victory, yet also of the cost. Families of Hood's crew, too, reflected on the symmetry. Their sons had been avenged, but the sea had claimed thousands more. Documentaries aired across the BBC, stirring public interest in naval history. Younger generations discovered the drama of the hunt, while older ones revisited emotions buried for decades. The rediscovery bridged past and present, ensuring Bismarck's saga remained alive in memory. She was no longer only a story of war, but of remembrance and reconciliation. The sight of her beneath the waves was haunting, yet strangely peaceful. Britain, too, recognized her as part of a shared human tragedy. Today, the wreck of Bismarck endures as one of the most iconic relics of World War II. Resting nearly 16,000 feet below the surface, she lies silent, her guns pointing into eternity. To some, she represents the pinnacle of naval engineering, a marvel of design and power. To others, she embodies hubris, a futile gamble that ended in fire and ruin. To all, she is a reminder of the human lives bound to her steel, men who never returned home. Ballard's discovery gave the world a window into the past, a chance to reflect on war's glory and futility alike. The wreck is more than twisted metal. It is history made tangible, a classroom beneath the waves. As cameras sweep her decks today, the sense of awe remains undiminished. The Atlantic guards her as both grave and monument. The legacy of Bismarck, rediscovered, is one of memory, sacrifice, and the silence of the deep